If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description. Welcome to MINDSHOCK True Crime. This is your host, Bruce McGuire. Today we are taking a look at the infamous and brutal 1991 Austin yogurt shop killings. And this is a case that I actually was not aware of until it was requested on MINDSHOCK. And this is an unsolved quadruple homicide from Austin, Texas. And we'll be diving deep in typical MINDSHOCK fashion with logic and reason at the forefront, trying to discern fact from fiction, which theories have the most merit based on available information without falling for any logical fallacies in an exhaustive and comprehensive fashion that MINDSHOCK listeners are accustomed to. And that's, of course, why we get so many requests for so many cases, because in the mainstream media or on other podcasts, they seem to be just cursory overviews, brief overviews without deep dive focus and examination of all possible theories and avenues, because cases that are unsolved, I mean, that's what you gotta do, because if you weren't there, you don't know what happened. Obviously, the MINDSHOCK motto is, the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. So we're not going to pretend and hallucinate we know what's more or less likely based on incomplete information. We can only do that based on variables that are clearly defined and can be verified, not opinions. As always, if you enjoy the MINDSHOCK podcast, find it interesting and informative, and want to help support MINDSHOCK, help us keep up awareness in unsolved cases, missing persons cases, wrongful convictions, and more, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. You could also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube, help support the channel that way, and get access to exclusive streams and chats. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications, like and share the podcast, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic logical analysis, co-podcast requests. You could also be a guest in the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. Alright, so let's start off with the breakdown. This is straight from Wiki before we go down all these different rabbit holes. The 1991 Austin yogurt shop killings are an unsolved quadruple homicide which took place at an I can't believe it's yogurt shop in Austin, Texas on Friday, December 6th, 1991. The victims were 4 teenage girls: 13-year-old Amy Ayers, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas, 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison, and Jennifer's 15-year-old sister, Sarah. Jennifer and Eliza were employees of the shop, while Sarah and her friend Amy were in the shop to get a ride home with Jennifer after it closed at 11 p.m. Approximately 1 hour before closing time, a man who tried to hustle customers in his queue was permitted to use the toilet in the back, took a very long time, and may have jammed a rear door open. A couple who left the shop just before 11 p.m. when Jennifer locked the front door to prevent more customers entering, reported seeing 2 men at a table acting furtively. Around midnight, a police patrolman reported a fire in the shop, and first responders discovered the bodies of the girls inside. The victims had been shot in the head, some had been raped. A .22 and a .380 pistol were used to commit the murders, and the perpetrator or perpetrators probably exited out through a back door that was found unlocked. The organized method of operation, ability to control the victims, and destruction of evidence by arson pointed to an adult experienced in crime rather than teenagers, according to one of the original detectives on the case. Austin Police Department has DNA from an unknown male as a result of one of the rapes. A Y chromosome match for the perpetrator DNA has been found in a research database of the FBI, but it has declined to reveal the identity of the man, in accordance with the law of anonymity for donors, and because thousands of men could bear this fragment of DNA which is unable to identify individuals. Killings. Shortly before midnight on Friday, December 6, 1991, a patrolman from the Austin Police Department noticed the fire coming from an I can't believe it's yogurt shop and reported it to his dispatcher. After the fire was extinguished, firefighters discovered 4 nude bodies. Each had been shot in the head execution style with a .22 cal lead bullet. Sarah's hands had been bound behind her with a pair of panties, and she had also been gagged and raped. Jennifer was not bound, but her hands were behind her back. Eliza had been gagged, and her hands were also tied behind her back. All 3 had been severely charred and shot in the back of the head. Unlike the others, Amy's body was found in a separate part of the shop. She was not charred, but she had received second and very early third-degree burns on 25 to 30% of her body. She was found with a sock-like cloth around her neck. She had been shot the same as the others, however, the bullet had missed her brain. She also had a second bullet, which had caused severe damage to her brain, exiting through her lateral cheek and jawline. It is thought that the killers had stacked all 4 bodies on top of each other, but that Amy had pulled herself off and managed to crawl to a different part of the store. This is just crazy. That's just unimaginable. Sarah's and Eliza's bodies were found stacked on top of each other with Jennifer's body, which is theorized to have been stacked on top of the others but had been disturbed when AB crawled away. Autopsy results show high levels of BTU output, which suggests an accelerant may have been used. Initial investigations had produced a large number of persons of interest, among them a 15-year-old caught with a .22, not established to be the murder weapon, in a nearby mall days after the killings. Although he initially gave promising information, after tough questioning, the detectives decided that he was trying to get himself out of the gun charge and eliminated him and 3 petty criminal friends whom he had implicated, none of whom were older than 17 at the time. Several years later, a new detective on the case theorized that the 4 teens from 1991 were credible suspects. By that time, they were in their 20s. In a string of interrogations conducted by various detectives, confessions were obtained from some of the suspects. They said all 4, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn, had participated in the murder. No record was kept of what was said to the men in the 1991 interrogations, making it impossible to know whether the detectives had supplied information to the suspects in the initial interrogations. Man, that's terrible. So there was no record. Oh, that's really bad. Such information could be used to implicate the suspects in later interrogations if they were to reference it. 2 of the 4 were sent to trial entirely due to their self-incriminating statements. The prosecution went into great detail about the horrific nature of the crimes against the young victims, but presented no hard evidence other than the confessions. The 2 were convicted, one being sentenced to death, the other sentenced to life imprisonment because he had been 15 at the time. However, the prosecution's tactic of using excerpts of each one's alleged confessions at the other's trial was ruled to have violated the confrontation clause because the co-defendant was non-testifying. Both convictions were overturned on the confrontation clause alone, and the men were freed in 2009. So they were in prison. It just says several years later they got into prison. So they're in prison for over a decade, almost 2 decades, just from their confessions. The prosecution insisted they would be retried. However, forensic investigation showed that DNA found in a victim was not theirs, nor was it of the other 2 implicated in their confessions. Okay, so this DNA could match thousands upon thousands of people, but not everybody, and so they could have been ruled out, and they were, and that's if the DNA tech can't be trusted. The prosecution consequently abandoned plans for a retrial. Texas courts later decided that those released were not entitled to compensation because they had not proven that they did not commit the crime. Wait, what? Isn't it innocent until proven guilty in a court of law? And guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Obviously, hearsay in the words of humans, that's not actual evidence. Now, that could be in addition to real evidence to wrap up a case neatly, but that's why there's all these confessions. There's so many confessions in famous cases. These are obvious nut jobs confessing. You can't, that's not proof of a crime. There's so many random nut jobs who are even proven to be elsewhere confessing to famous crimes. You can't just put them in prison because they confessed. especially if they have some kind of mental condition and they don't even understand what they're doing. One of the detectives in the interrogations, Hector Polanco, has been accused of coercing false confessions in the notorious case of Christopher Ochoa and Richard Danziger. Both were released after 13 years in prison. Danziger was assaulted in prison, which resulted in permanent brain damage. What? Man, so this Hector Polanco scumbag, he's got a history of coercing false confessions. Wow, that's messed up. Yeah, that does not bode well for these. 7 jurors from the trials have stated that they would not have convicted the men had this evidence been available at the time. So yeah, the juror said, yeah, if we knew that a guy known for coercing false confessions was in charge of these interrogations, wow. But even, whether he was or he wasn't, again, I mean, if you only the words of humans are not solid evidence, how is that anywhere near the threshold of beyond a reasonable doubt? I mean, this is crazy. I mean, even if they're all guilty, I mean, you have to have some kind of evidence, not just words. Yeah, this is rough. At the time of the killings, a known serial killer, Kenneth Allen McDuff, was in the area. He had a history of multiple murders involving teenagers, but was soon ruled out. He was executed November 17th, 1998. And we'll get into him and the exact methodology of how he was ruled out. False confessions. Austin police admit that over 50 people, including McDuff, on the day of his execution had confessed to the yogurt shop murders. A confession in 92 by 2 Mexican nationals held by Mexican authorities was soon disputed and finally ruled false. Yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously serial killers just wanting to screw around, I mean, they could confess to crimes they didn't commit, of course, but... 2006, Springsteen conviction overturned. In 2006, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned Robert Springsteen's conviction on the basis of an unfair trial. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to reinstate the conviction in February 2007. In 2008, Scott and Springsteen request DNA tests. On August 20th, 2008, the defense lawyers for Scott and Springsteen requested DNA testing of alternative suspects. No matches against evidence discovered earlier that year were found. 7 jurors from the trials have stated that they would not have convicted the men had this evidence been available at the time. 2009, release of Scott and Springsteen. On Wednesday, June 24, 2009, Judge Mike Lynch ruled in response to Travis County DA Rosemary Lemberg's request that one of the trials be continued, that defendants Springsteen and Scott be freed on bond pending their upcoming trials. At 2:50 p.m. that day, they both walked out of the Travis County jail with their attorneys. Later that day, Lemberg responded to Lynch's decision with the following statement. Today I requested a continuance in the case against Michael Scott, a defendant in the yogurt shop murders whose trial was scheduled to begin on July 6th. Judge Mike Lynch granted that motion, but also released both Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen on personal bond as he indicated he would do in his previous scheduling order. Requesting a delay in the case was a difficult decision, but one that I believe is the best course toward an ultimate successful prosecution of this important matter. Knowing that Judge Lynch would release both defendants, we requested certain conditions on their bonds requiring them to remain in Travis County and report to the court any change of residence, to have no contact with the victims' families or witnesses, that they not carry weapons or consume alcohol or illegal drugs, that they report to the court on a routine basis and attend all court appearances. As you know, both Springsteen and Scott were convicted by juries in June 2001 and September 2002. Their convictions were then overturned by the appellate court, but their statements to law enforcement were found to be voluntarily given. And voluntarily given or not, if there's no actual physical evidence, how are they guilty? Since the original trial of these 2 men, new developments in DNA technology has become available. As we prepared for retrial March 2008, we submitted various evidentiary items for what we call YSTR testing. This test looks for male DNA only and is deemed to be the most accurate test for samples that are mixtures of female and male DNA, as in this case. We sought this testing because we have an ongoing duty and responsibility to use the most up-to-date science available to seek the truth in this and all cases we prosecute. Currently, it is clear to me that our evidence in the death of these 4 young women includes DNA from one male whose identity is not yet known to us. The defense asserts that the testing reveals more than one unknown male, but the evidence present at the hearing on Thursday, June 18, contradicts that notion. The reliable scientific evidence in the case presents one and only one unknown male donor. Given that I could not in good conscience allow the case to go to trial before the identity of this male donor is determined and the full truth is known, I remain confident that both Springsteen and Scott are responsible for the deaths at the yogurt shop. but it would not be prudent to risk a trial until we know the nature of involvement on this unknown male. So none of their DNA is present. There's no actual physical evidence against them. The actual DNA and physical evidence is of somebody else, but he might not be responsible. The DNA, the nature of involvement of the guys whose DNA who's there is unknown. Yet these other guys are somehow guilty. Wow, what a sham. And even if they are guilty, again, this is still a sham because where's the evidence? My office and the Austin Police Department remain committed to these cases. Their further investigation will continue to be a priority. My commitment to the victims, their families, and the community is that we will not give up until all of the people responsible for these terrible and tragic murders are brought to justice. On October 28, 2009, all charges were dismissed against Scott and Springsteen. 2010, the death of Maurice Pierce. On December 23rd, 2010, Austin police officer Frank Wilson and his rookie partner Bradley Smith conducted a traffic stop on a vehicle driven by Maurice Pierce in the northern part of the city. After a brief foot pursuit, Pierce struggled with Wilson before removing a knife from his belt and stabbing Wilson in the neck. Wilson, who survived his injuries, subsequently pulled out a gun and shot and killed Pierce. Maurice Pierce has been identified as one of the 4 teenage suspects in 1991, and who was later arrested after new interrogations took place in 1998 and 99. Charges against Pierce were eventually dismissed. 2021 cold case legislation. On December 8, 2021, the House Judiciary Committee passed legislation from Representative Michael McCall giving the families of cold case victims the opportunity to petition the federal government to re-examine cases older than 3 years. 2022 DNA results. February 5th, 2022, it was announced that advanced DNA technology was bringing investigators closer than ever to solving the crime. And we'll get into that as well. Alright, so that's the general overview here. So is this just a botched investigation with coerced confessions? Or is this a mix of like crazy people who may possibly have been involved in the crime and did confess? But there's just another party. The other thing is, like, the last known sightings were there only 2 people in the shop, but then, and were they seen to have left? The 2 men that were furtively, behavior was described as furtive. And so, whatever, agitated, busy, looking like they're scheming or plotting, whatever. And yet there was another guy who used the bathroom and left that back door open. So was it determined that the 2 men that were in the yogurt shop actually left? I mean, we'll get into all the fine details here, but that's just what jumped out at me immediately. There's just a lot of funny business in this case. And this is 1991, so again, like, there's not a lot of surveillance technology here in the 90s. So it's very tough. So let's look at CBSNews.com, February 5th, 2022. The yogurt shop murders families investigators remain haunted by unsolved case. 3 decades ago, 4 teenage girls were brutally murdered in an I can't believe it's yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. The horrific crime has haunted their families, the city, and the investigators who chased every lead in the case to a dead end. Could new information finally help solve the case? I can see them. I can still see the inside of that place. John Jones. This is John Jones with an H. Not John Jones without the H, the MMA fighter. John Jones, the first investigator on the case, tells 48 Hours correspondent Erin Moriarty. That stuff's indelibly burned in my mind. The story starts on December 6, 1991, when Eliza Thomas, Sarah and Jennifer Harbison, and Amy Ayers were tied up and shot. The yogurt shop was then set on fire. For decades, investigators worked to find suspects. There were eventually arrests and even convictions, but those convictions were overturned, leaving the case unsolved today. There is a kind of torture that continues by the fact that it's unsolved and it's ongoing, says Sonora Thomas, who was 13 when her sister Eliza was killed. It's always there, says Jones. There may be some positive news, however. A small sample of male DNA was found on one of the victims. With DNA research advancing, investigators hope there will be a match that solves the case. Do you believe that there is right now some evidence that could lead to the killers? Moriarty asks Texas defense attorney Joe James Sawyer. We have John Jones, Joe James. Yes, Sawyer says. Is this the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end? Jones asked. The search for answers. It's been 30 years since John Jones began the painstaking search for the killers of 4 teenage girls in Austin, Texas yogurt shop. He has long since retired from the Austin Police Department and moved out of Texas, but copies of some of the case files moved with him. Every year marks another year. You know there's no closure, retired Austin Detective John Jones told 48 Hours correspondent Aaron Moriarty. I still have insomnia 30 years after the fact. Aaron Moriarty with Jones in his home office. What is all of this here? These are my notes. Oh, that's the big book. This is really from day one. Hypnosis, polygraph, and confessions. Aaron picks up a coffee mug. You know, I noticed this sitting here, yeah? Reads coffee mug. We will not forget. You haven't. Nope, I can't. The images of December 6, 1991 remain all too vivid. I can definitely still see it. It started with that call from dispatch to go to a scene of a fire that would turn into something far worse. And the dispatch call here, John Jones says, what do you got out there? I'm en route, Airport 35. We've got a fire. Okay, I'm copying the fire part, but can you cut out on the first part of that? Apparently a robbery and homicide. There's 3 fatalities. John Jones states, that's 10-4, we're en route, turns on siren. John Jones now in this interview states, and then about halfway there they call again on the radio and said we found a 4th body. A local TV news crew happened to be filming Jones on a ride-along that night. Uh-oh. Oh, man. Are we starting the coincidence stack already? John Jones on the radio. What place of business is this at? Dispatch says, it's the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. John Jones says, okay. John Jones now in this interview states, the fire department had just knocked down the fire. There was still a lot of water in there, a lot of smoke still. It was all muted grays, blacks. There was no color in there with the exception of the girls. The girls were quickly identified. 2 had been working at the shop, closing up that night. Eliza Thomas and Jennifer Harbison were both 17. Jennifer's 15-year-old sister Sarah and their friend, 13-year-old Amy Ayers, had met them there to head home. The 4 girls had been gagged, tied up with their own clothing, and shot in the head. Investigators would learn at least one of the victims had been sexually assaulted. The yogurt shop had also been set on fire, destroying potential evidence. John Jones states there was smoke and soot on every surface, kind of made fingerprinting kind of difficult. This was a crime like none Austin had seen before. Jones knew he needed help and from the scene contacted the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the FBI, and Texas Department of Public Safety. As soon as we knew what type of guns we were looking for, that information went out nationwide. Gunshot wounds showed that 2 different types of guns were used, leading investigators to believe that there were at least 2 killers on the loose. What were the 2 guns? A .380 and a .22, and we recovered all of the rounds. The weapons, though, were not found, and a task force worked to come up with potential suspects. John Jones states they were from all spectrums. I mean, we looked at everybody, from family members to drifters. And while police tracked down leads, the families and the city of Austin grieved. The Harbison family lost their only children. Daughters Jennifer, a hardworking high school senior, and Sarah, who was enjoying sports and clubs as a high school freshman. Their mother, Barbara, spoke with 48 Hours in 1992. Barbara stated, my life was focused around them from here to eternity. Someone took eternity away from me. Bob Ayers is the father of the youngest victim, Amy, a country girl with a love for animals. Bob Ayers stated, I lost my daughter. I lost my first dance. I won't see her graduate. I won't see her become a veterinarian. She was a daddy's girl. Sonora Thomas, 13 years old when her only sibling Eliza was murdered, had a hard time dealing with the loss of the sister she looked up to. Sonora stated, I remember the shock. I remember fantasizing for days that my sister had somehow escaped and run away. She was going to come back, and so that's what I was kind of holding on to. Her parents struggled as well. Sonora stated, my family never talked about my sister after she died. Aaron Moriarty asked, never? Sonora responded, no. It's too painful. Sonora did as best she could, picking up some pieces of her sister's life. Eliza, an animal lover, had a pig she planned to enter in a livestock show. Just a few months after the murders, Sonora took over those duties. While Sonora may have seemed to be coping, in the reality, she says, was far different. Aaron stated, "You had to grow up quickly." Sonora responds, "Very quickly. I would say I fell apart under that pressure." John Jones stated, "We knew they were hurting because, we were hurting too." Jones, a parent himself, felt the family's grief. He promised to do all he could to help them. Jones stated, "We told them what we could, and I assured them that we would keep them apprised as to everything that was happening, and we did." Jones also made a pledge to the families involving the shirt he wore on the night of the murders. John Jones stated, "I kind of made a promise to them that the next time they saw me with that green and white shirt on, that was a signal to them that, we knew who did it." And Jones seemed assured they would find the killers. I wonder why he felt that way. John Jones stated, "We stayed in constant contact with this behavioral science unit at the FBI in Quantico. They said that I should, as the face of the investigation, I should project an air of confidence. That would cause the bad guy to shiver in his boots. So look in the camera and be confident." And when we followed him working the case in 1992, he did just that. John Jones stated, "Let me just say this, whoever you are out there, you are going to be mine one of these days." But trying to figure that out was daunting. John Jones at police station in 1992, 342 people that have been listed as suspects, but we're looking at pages and pages of suspects here. Okay, so if they have 342 suspects, at least we can say this seems to be a thorough investigation. I mean, they have 342 people listed as suspects. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, that's really crazy. One of those early suspects was a teenager named Maurice Pierce. He was arrested 8 days after the murders at a mall near the yogurt shop, carrying a .22 cal gun, the type used in the murders. John Jones stated the .22s were unmatchable. Aaron stated, "So you can't say it wasn't his gun, but there was no way to match it." John Jones, "No. But there was no way to match it." Jones stated, "To prove that it was his gun, he gave a statement. Matter of fact, I took his statement, and he implicated 3 other boys." You know what's weird here, though? The symmetry. 4 victims, 4 suspects. One supposed piece of DNA that doesn't match any of the 4. Jones says Maurice Pierce claimed he was driving a getaway car and that 3 acquaintances, Forrest Welburn, Michael Scott, and Robert Springsteen, were involved in the murders, but Pierce's story began to fall apart. John Jones stated, "It started to crater when we wired him up to go talk to Forrest. And we were listening in on the wire, and it was pretty obvious Forrest didn't know what Maurice was talking about." So is this a case of Maurice just being spooked, believing that they were going to put him away no matter what, and making up this story to try to bring down other people that he might have known to save himself, even though he was innocent and the others were innocent? At least of this crime. I mean, they might have been criminals in other facets. And when Welburn, Scott, and Springsteen were brought in for questioning, they too denied any involvement. It was decided there was not enough evidence to charge them, and the search for other suspects continued. Chasing leads. 2 months after the yogurt shop murders, with no viable suspects, police were chasing leads no matter where it took them. The task force became aware of a counterculture type group of local residents known to be into the supernatural. Here we go again, shades of West Memphis 3. Detective Mike Huckabee at a roundtable in 1992 stated, "They're into vampires, the occult, graveyard rites. They go out and dance and take pictures on tombstones." And investigators began to hear that this group might be connected to something far more serious. John Jones in 2021 stated the tips were that they were talking about the murders. Aaron asked, "Talking about the yogurt shop murders?" John Jones responds, "The yogurt shop murders, yes." There was one woman in particular whose name kept coming up in connection with these tips. The task force planned a raid on her home, hoping to see if any evidence might be found there. "It was creepy in there," John Jones states, "but as it turns out, a lot of that stuff was rat bones and theatrical parts, but it was a good lead till we finally figured out that they're just living a make-believe life." in parentheses, shaking his head about it. The raid may have been a bust, but it wasn't long before the task force had its eyes on another person of interest. A police sketch shows a man that multiple eyewitnesses told police they saw sitting in a car outside the yogurt shop on the night of the murders. John Jones stated, and it was somebody we really wanted to talk to, so we put it out there. And the response they got came from an unexpected source. John Jones stated a couple of other investigators from the sex crimes unit came up and go, "We have a sketch that looks just like that." 3 weeks before the yogurt shop murders, a young woman in Austin had been kidnapped and sexually assaulted. Police had released a sketch of 3 men wanted in connection with that crime. One of the suspects bore a striking resemblance to that man witnesses reported sitting in a car outside the yogurt shop. John Jones stated, I just kind of went zip when I saw the composite. A tip came in that the men wanted in the kidnapping and sexual assault case had fled to Mexico. The 2 were caught and arrested, one who resembled the person of interest in the yogurt shop sketch. The development made national news. In the fall of '92, 2 men wanted for an unrelated kidnapping and sexual assault in Austin were arrested in Mexico. The man on the right bore a striking resemblance to someone witnesses reported seeing outside the yogurt shop on the night of the murders. When questioned by Austin investigators, the men initially denied any involvement in the yogurt shop murders, but when interrogated by Mexican authorities, they confessed. However, details they gave didn't match the evidence found at the crime scene. And when Austin detectives re-questioned the men, they recanted. What kind of questioning how was the interrogation in Mexico? Were they torturing them? Also, how popular was this yogurt shop in Austin? Because if dozens, if not hundreds of people regularly visited it, surely some possible sex offenders and criminals might visit the shop as well, and might be outside the shop and have had nothing to do with these particular murders. John Jones stated, when they got caught in Mexico, we went down there to interview them. Jones's team questioned the men, and so too did the Mexican authorities. John Jones stated, but the Mexican government announced to the whole world that they confessed and they were going to try them for the murders down there. How would they be able to do that? Aaron Murray said they confessed to the yogurt shop murders. John Jones stated, yes, they did. But Jones learned that those confessions had details that didn't match the crime scene. Even the caliber of guns they claimed to use was wrong. John Jones stated there were too many inconsistencies in the confession. So Jones's team re-interviewed the men, and he says this time they recanted just about everything. What does that mean? Just about everything, but not everything? So did they admit to being in the general area? It made Jones and other investigators wonder if those confessions were coerced by the Mexican authorities. The once promising lead fell apart. What about the DNA test? Did they ever go back and check those guys to see if they could be excluded? John Jones stated it was depressing. Over the following years, there'd be other confessions, ones that were willingly given. We faced 6 confessions. 6 people who confessed, Aaron asked? Yeah, written. That confessed to this crime. Yes, they did. And they didn't do it? Nope. In 1994, after nearly 3 years of leading the investigation, John Jones was moved out of the homicide division. He says it was a mutual decision. Austin police wanted fresh eyes working the case, and Jones felt it was time to move on. Other detectives took over, and as time passed, the victims' families were left wondering why no one has been arrested. Amy Ayers' mother, Pam, spoke to 48 Hours in 1996. Pam Ayers, fighting back tears, they're probably out there leading a life as normal as they've ever had, and ours is never going to be the same. Not necessarily. A lot of these criminal scumbags also live criminal scumbag lives and end up dead in a ditch somewhere. So, some of them do, some of them don't, but you never know. That same year, Eliza Thomas's mom moved away from Austin and the painful reminders. Maria Thomas, 96, running into people who were constantly asking how the case was going was very hard on me, and especially my daughter, Sonora. Sonora's life had taken a downward spiral. Sonora Thomas stated, in my high school years, things really deteriorated. Drugs, using alcohol, being hospitalized, going to a boarding school for, disturbed teenagers, things like that. The case seemed stalled until October 1999. Radio news reports some breaking news. Austin police have arrested 4 men in connection with the yogurt shop murders of 1991. There were finally arrests, but would it answer the question on the billboard that had been haunting Austin for nearly a decade? Suspects arrested. News report: after nearly 8 years, Austinites are getting some answers in the case of the yogurt shop murders. Mayor Kirk Watson, at a 1999 press conference, stated, "I want to start off by thanking y'all for joining us here today. For almost 8 years, we've all waited to hear the words that our police department is close to a point of solving a crime that has haunted our very souls. Today, we finally get to hear those words." When 4 men were arrested in the fall of '99 for the yogurt shop murders, a relief was felt citywide. Mayor Kirk Watson, at a press conference, stated, "Sarah, Jennifer, Amy, Eliza, we did not forget." The girls' families struggled to take it all in. Sonora Thomas stated there had been so many false leads for such a long time, it was hard to know how to think about it and how to feel about it. In October '99, nearly 8 years after the yogurt shop murders, Austin police announced the arrest of 4 suspects in the case: Maurice Pierce, Forrest Welborn, Robert Springsteen, and Michael Scott. All 4 men had been questioned within days of the murders, but the lack of any hard evidence connecting them to the crime meant that none of them were charged at the time. I mean, they don't particularly look like upstanding individuals, but again, that doesn't mean they were guilty of this particular crime, especially with no evidence. But there were finally names and faces to blame: Maurice Pierce, Forrest Welborn, Michael Scott, and Robert Springsteen. To the task force, they were familiar names and faces. They were the same young men that John Jones and his investigators questioned just 8 days after the murders and ultimately released for lack of evidence. John Jones stated, "I was confident and remain confident to this day that we got as far with them as we could then. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't something developed later that would cause them to actually go out and arrest them. So I was going, yes, good job. I was ready to dig out the hideous green and white shirt. But before that shirt would come out of the closet, the one he promised the girls' families he would wear when the case was solved, Jones wanted to know more about what led to the arrests." Joe James Sawyer stated there was no physical evidence. Nothing. Joe James Sawyer was appointed as Robert Springsteen's attorney. Erin Morrity asks what made them go back and charge these guys. Joe James Sawyer stated, "Because the new officers, when they reopened the cold case, convinced themselves that we let them slip through our fingers. We had to have the murderers in the beginning. In part, they decided that because they had nothing else." That doesn't sound good. There was no new physical evidence suddenly tying any of the 4 men to the crime, but what police did have were 2 newly obtained confessions, one from Michael Scott and another from Sawyer's own client, Robert Springsteen. Michael Scott's confession came first. He was questioned for over 4 days. So this was a 20-hour interrogation during which Scott confessed to taking part in the yogurt shop murders. Days later, Robert Springsteen also confessed under questioning. Despite both men later claiming their confessions were coerced, they would eventually be convicted. So they both technically recanted and claimed those. And these are not quick little confessions. These are 20-hour interrogation over days. So, I mean, especially if it also involved an officer known for getting false, coerced confessions. So, I mean, this is weird too, because in this tiny little room, I mean, you could see from the cam here, in this tiny little room for countless hours, just grueling. I mean, yeah, it's really rough, especially weak-minded individuals, particularly petty criminals who might believe that their best bet is to confess and cut a deal. When there's so much corruption rampant, I mean, if they truly believe their best bet is to falsely confess in order to cut a deal, or they're so mentally out of it. I mean, one of the most famous cases of this is Brendan Dassey, of course, regarding the Stephen Avery and Teresa Hallback case of making a murderer fame. I mean, this poor kid is just badgered by these so-called adults. I mean, these poor excuses for humans who are just berating this mentally challenged teenager until he just clearly tells them what they want to hear. I mean, these are some heartbreaking videos of the Brendan Dassey interrogation with no lawyer present. I mean, it's just, the corruption in Manitowoc is just so obvious and runs so deep. But even for full adults, I mean, again, there's just so many cases of these false coerced confessions. I mean, it wasn't clear from the overview breakdown, but now that we're getting into the details of how these confessions were obtained and how both of these guys who gave confessions said that they were coerced. So they didn't maintain that the confessions were valid. And even if they had, again, that still doesn't mean they did it. I mean, there's plenty of crazy people out there giving false confessions. In this case, also, I mean, Jones said there were plenty of other people who falsely confessed as well. I mean, could they all be? I mean, all of them were guilty? Obviously not. Unless someone thinks there's like 20 people committing this one crime in this little yogurt shop. Okay, so in the 99 interrogation, officer states, "Come on, Michael, you're doing good. Tell us, let's do this today, let's do it." Michael Scott stated, "I remember seeing the girls. I remember one girl screaming, terrified." I mean, those aren't exactly, I mean, that doesn't sound like smoking gun information there. I mean, that would be in any crime. Scott told investigators that he and the others only intended a simple robbery. He said they called the yogurt shop earlier that day. I mean, did they verify that? And then after dark, he said they came back armed with 2 guns. Michael Scott in the interrogation stated, "I hear the gun go off. I only pulled the trigger once. I hear another gun go off." Investigators claimed that Springsteen later corroborated much of what Scott said, but after intense questioning, he went further. The officer in the interrogation said, "You expletive, no. If you expletive raped her, just say it." Robert Springsteen stated, "I stuck my expletive in her expletive, and I raped her." Springsteen told them he shot one girl and raped her. Joe James Sawyer stated he was so tired of this, he'd already been questioned, he'd already been through that mill. He thought, you know what? I'll tell you any damn thing you want. Sawyer maintains his client is innocent and says the confession was coerced. In 2009, Robert Springsteen explained to 48 Hours why he would admit to something so horrible, something he says he didn't do. Robert Springsteen stated, "I was berated and berated and berated by the police officers. Until they obtained what it was they wanted to hear, they were not going to allow me to leave. And they broke me down." So, I mean, yeah, I mean, if they're just doing constant interrogation for days on end, and he truly believed this would go on forever, I mean, what would an average person do? I mean, how long would an average person last? Erin Moriarty states, "Let me just ask, did you have anything to do?" Robert Springsteen interrupts, "No, I did not." "With the murders at the yogurt shop?" "No, never." Even though Joe James Sawyer didn't have Michael Scott as his client, he says he has serious concerns about his confession, too. The officer in the interrogation stated, "Is that the gun you shot somebody with, Mike? Is that the gun you walked up behind somebody with and shot in the head?" Joe James Sawyer stated, "I frankly couldn't believe it. They terrorized him and he was afraid to say no." They also are they giving away details here? Walked behind somebody and shot, and were the exact details of how they were shot released? Because, I mean, this is kind of important information to know to separate the false confessions. Forrest Welborn denied having anything to do with the murders, but police were convinced he was the lookout that night, and Michael Scott placed him at the scene. Erin Moriarty spoke to Welborn in 1999 in jail shortly after his arrest. Erin asked, "Were you there that night?" Forrest Welborn stated, "No." "Were you there as a lookout?" "No, I'm innocent." "You had nothing to do with this?" "Nothing at all." Forrest Welborn had been questioned multiple times by investigators over the years, and he never wavered. It would be curious, did they ever do a 4-day, 20-hour interrogation with him, or were they just these, cursory interrogations? He, like the others, first came on the police radar when in 1991, just days after the murders, Maurice Pierce had been caught with a .22 cal gun at the mall near the yogurt shop. Pierce told the detectives back then that he had given the handgun to Welborn and that it had been used in the yogurt shop murders. Erin asks, "Why would he say that?" Forrest Welborn stated, "I don't know." Welborn has always maintained his innocence despite pressure from the police. Forrest Welborn stated, "They would get right in my face, tell me everything I said was a lie." Remember, false confessions in this case were nothing new. Jones said that 6 written false confessions were obtained when he was in charge. So when he learned that the 2 confessions were all the new investigators seemed to have, it gave him pause. John Jones stated, "I go, well, maybe I shouldn't get that shirt out just yet." It wasn't long before the case against the men began crumbling. Charges against Forrest Welborn were dismissed after 2 grand juries failed to indict him. And later on, charges were dropped against Maurice Pierce for lack of evidence. Everything fell apart except the cases against Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen. And with Scott and Springsteen's confessions, the victims' families felt prosecutors had a strong case. I mean, that's very telling, too, that they had literally nothing on Wellborn or Pierce, and technically nothing on Springsteen and Scott as well, other than the, 20-hour interrogation confession. Barbara Ayers Wilson, outside the courthouse in 2010, stated, "These young men have been implicated and they have confessed, and they can withdraw it, but the truth is they actually were there and they actually did the murders." I mean, how would she know, though? Okay, a DNA breakthrough. In 2001, nearly 10 years after the murders of Eliza Thomas, Amy Ayers, and Sarah and Jennifer Harbison, the yogurt shop murder trials began. Both defendants, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, faced the death penalty. Joe James Sawyer stated, "The only thing that ever tied Robert or Mike Scott to that crime scene were their confessions." Confessions that both defendants said were coerced. The two were tried separately. Springsteen's trial was first. Neither of the men would testify against one another, so instead prosecutors used their confessions against one another, reading parts of the confessions to the juries. Springsteen's lawyer, Joe James Sawyer, was frustrated that he couldn't cross-examine Scott. Joe James Sawyer stated, "I thought the trial was massively unfair to my client and that it was being done systematically and with deliberation." That's messed up, too, because you can't cross-examine him. What kind of trial is this? The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 13 hours and then reached a verdict. Jury, 4 persons, stated, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Springsteen IV, guilty of the offense of capital murder." Guilty. Springsteen was condemned to death row. So all they did was read excerpts back and forth from coerced confessions. Wow, what a sham of a trial. I mean, even if these guys are guilty, I mean, this is just a complete sham of a trial. In 2002, Michael Scott went on trial. He was convicted as well. He was sentenced to life in prison, but the case didn't end there. 15 years after the murders came a shocking turn of events. News report. In a 5-4 decision, the court behind me said that Michael Scott's constitutional rights were violated during his trial and therefore should get a new one. Both Scott and Springsteen's convictions were overturned on constitutional grounds. The Sixth Amendment gives defendants the right to confront accusers. And remember, in Scott and Springsteen's trials, their confessions were used against one another, but they weren't allowed to question each other in court. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, this is it possible this is even more of a sham trial than the Stephen Avery case? I mean, this is insane. Joe James Sawyer stated, "And the relief was incredible, but that relief for the defendants came as a devastating blow to the victims' families." I mean, why would that be, though? Because if they're really after the truth, I mean, this is kind of just a ruling out false leads situation. We later spoke to Eliza Thomas's mother, Maria, about that moment. Maria Thomas stated, "Every time I hear those words, that their rights were violated, I just feel like I'm going to go insane. Their rights are violated, our girls were murdered." Correct. More than... people's rights are violated all the time. But the thing is, I mean, if they really want to get the real murderers, I mean, like, why would they not want to get the real guys who actually did it? Like, that's what you do by meeting the burden of proof. And, when rogue cops get these false confessions, I mean, that does not help justice. And it's this is like a long ripple effect, because there's a long history of coerced confessions. Now, sometimes you could say it's justified when they know the guy actually did it. Like, they actually have hard evidence. They know for sure he did it. And then they also want to get a confession. I mean, who gives a crap about his rights at that point? Because if you know for sure 100% he already is the guy, then you can interrogate him for 20 hours all you want, because you already know he's the guy, and you want to crack him for the confession. That's perfectly fine. But doing it to countless innocent people, I mean, that's just insane. And that other innocent people are also going to be more likely to falsely confess because they know the system is corrupt. And they might think that that's their best option at the time, which, of course, that's not how you get justice. Sonora Thomas stated, "It ruins your sense of fairness. It ruins your sense of that we live in a just world." I mean, that's just making it worse, though, because when you're violating the rights of people, in addition to obviously all the violated rights of the murdered. I mean, again, the goal should be to get actual justice, not any old guys just for the sake of closure. I mean, that's another problem in the justice system. In a lot of cities and famous cases, they'll get anybody. They just want to close the case. Even though their convictions were overturned, Scott and Springsteen were not released. A new DA, Rosemary Lemberg, was determined to retry them. In an effort to find more evidence, her office had ordered DNA tests on vaginal swabs taken from the victims at the time of the murders. It's called YSTR testing and was fairly new in 2009 when 48 Hours spoke with DA Lemberg. Rosemary Lemberg stated this technology searches for male DNA only. A partial male DNA profile was obtained from one of the victims believed to have been sexually assaulted, and no one expected what it would reveal. Erin Mority stated, does the DNA match any of the 4 young men who were originally accused and 2 of them who've been convicted? Rosemary Lemberg stated, it does not. The DNA did not match any of the original 4 suspects, including Scott and Springsteen. And that's significant because Springsteen, in that confession he said was coerced, told investigators he raped one of the girls. C.C. Moore is a DNA expert and genetic genealogist whom we asked about the case and the role of YSTR DNA in criminal cases. C.C. Moore stated, it is a tool that can eliminate almost everyone. It should eliminate everybody but the suspect. Erin Mority asked, if their YSTR does not match, they did not contribute that DNA? C.C. stated, because of where that DNA was found, yes, in this case it's very important. The DA was focused on finding the source of that DNA. She wondered if Springsteen and Scott had another partner. Rosemary Lemberg stated, I remain really confident that both Springsteen and Scott were responsible for killing those 4 girls. But why, though? If all you have are 20-hour false coerced confession, I mean, it's so weird. Like, where's the confidence coming from? I mean, is this corruption, incompetence, a mix of both, egos? Because, I mean, how stupid do they look for actually going forward with trials on nothing, like no hard evidence? I mean, is this just to save face by these corrupt and or incompetent individuals who are unfortunately part of the court and justice system? But in 2009, with no matches on that DNA, Lemberg dropped charges against Springsteen and Scott. After nearly 10 years behind bars, they were released, but not exonerated, leaving open the possibility that they could be retried at a later time. Rosemary Lemberg at a press conference, this was a difficult decision and one I'd rather not have to make. The question remained, though, whose DNA was it? Amber Farrelly stated, I know who it is. Joe James Sawyer states, the killers. Erin asked, you're convinced? That. Amber stated that is a certain truth. Amber Farrelly was part of both Scott and Springsteen's defense teams. She came up with a theory that the mystery DNA might belong instead to 2 never identified men who witnesses reported seeing sitting in the yogurt shop just before it closed. That was my very first notion as well. I mean, if you guys remember at the beginning of the podcast, I mean, that's where my brain went immediately. Who were the 2 guys in the shop, the last guys in the shop, and who was the guy that used the bathroom and possibly left that back door open? Although it's possible that's just a theory that there was a back door propped open. If that's kind of a red herring theory and that's not true, then these 2 never identified men, so they never were able to identify the last 2 known customers. So technically, would these 2 last known customers not be the last to see these 4 teens alive? In which case, that puts them on the top of the list. Amber Farrelly stated those 2 men were described wearing fatigue-colored jackets. They were very slouched over, whispering, like it was a very close conversation in a booth. Officials tried to track down these 2 men as well as the sources of the DNA. And then, in 2017, an Austin police investigator searched a public DNA database to see if he could get a hit, and unbelievably he did. Michael McCall stated, I thought, my God, we actually have a shot to solve this crime after so many years. Who killed these girls? Congressman Michael McCall stated, I really thought this was it. I really thought we had a chance to solve it. United States Congressman Michael McCall, like so many others from Austin, hoped that the recently uncovered DNA in the yogurt shop murder case might finally bring answers to the victims' families. Congressman Michael McCall stated, we'll never forget that tragic day. It's stained in my memory. 25 years after the murders, the Austin Police Department went searching for a match to the YSTR DNA that had been found on the yogurt shop victim believed to have been sexually assaulted. And in 2017, they got a break. On a public DNA database used for population studies, investigators thought they had found a match. Congressman Michael McCall stated, I've seen DNA. prove homicide cases. The DNA evidence is really the key here. But that sample from the crime scene was not a complete DNA profile. It was just YSTR, the male portion of DNA, and it was not a very detailed sample, having just 16 markers. C.C. Moore stated 16 STRs is not a very powerful match. There could be millions of people with the same profile, so in genetic genealogy we usually use 67 or 111 markers, or maybe even more. Aaron Moriarty stated, but isn't it a place to start? It is, but it's not absolute, and if there's nothing else to work with, it's certainly something to look into. Still, it seemed to be the most promising lead in years, but there was a problem. The seemingly matching sample in the public database had been submitted anonymously by the FBI. It belonged to a federally convicted offender, arrestee, or detainee, but had no name attached to it. When Austin authorities tried to get a name, the FBI would not provide it, citing privacy laws. Privacy for criminals? Congressman Michael McCall stated there are some restrictions on privacy, and so it gets into some very sort of dicey issues. Frustrated, officials reached out to Congressman McCall for help. Congressman Michael McCall stated, and so I pressed the FBI very hard. Finally, in early 2020, the FBI agreed to work with the Austin Police Department to see if further testing could be done on the YSTR DNA from the crime scene. Well, why didn't they just supply the name? What? Congressman Michael McCall. I was very excited about it. The idea that we could bring this case to closure for the families and bring those responsible to justice. More advanced testing came up with additional markers, 25 instead of the original 16. But as so often happened in this case, what seemed so promising turned into disappointment. Some of the additional markers did not match the FBI sample. In other words, what seemed to be a match was not. In a letter to Congressman McCall, the FBI explained the new results conclusively exclude the male donor of the FBI sample. As such, the FBI YSTR profile is not an investigative lead. And here's the thing, if there is some kind of cover-up involved, like if they didn't want to supply the name because the name has something to do with something, would they concoct this story and would they manufacture this narrative? Again, I'm not saying anything is true or untrue. I'm just stating there's shady situations in many different cases. Because if this guy was some kind of informant or something... But the easy thing is, though, was this guy even in the Austin area? Because if this guy is confirmed to have been locked up at this time, or, halfway across the country, like completely confirmed, then there's nothing to even talk about. But if not, I don't know. Congressman Michael McCall stated, and that was the greatest disappointment because we really thought we had it. Aaron Moriarty stated, if it didn't match that individual, doesn't it mean there's somebody out there that this DNA belongs to somebody, right? Congressman Michael McCall says, it does, and that's why we're not going to rest till we find the match. Aaron stated, how important then is this DNA profile that exists to solving the case? Congressman McCall stated, it's everything. With DNA research advancing so quickly, there is hope that one day the sample of DNA obtained 30 years ago may finally solve this case. Still, it will not erase the pain or loss of lives. Sonora Thomas stated, every year that goes by, I get farther and farther away from my sister, and I worry about losing memories. Sonora Thomas struggled for years with panic attacks and physical pain until, with the help of therapy, she realized it was connected to the murder of her sister Eliza. With a unique understanding of what trauma victims experience, Sonora wanted to help others like her and become a therapist. There's so many moments, when your heart is open, you're joyful. But there's also this loss that's always accompanying your life. Sonora found it helpful to look for ways to remember Eliza. When we got married, we had a flower and an empty chair at our ceremony. And my sister was mentioned. Compounding Sonora's pain, her mother died in 2015. Maria Thomas passed away with so many unresolved questions about the murder of her daughter. Sonora Thomas stated there's a kind of torture that comes by the fact that it's unsolved and it's ongoing. John Jones also stated, shaking his head, it's always there. John Jones is still haunted by the fact that this case is unsolved, and by what he saw that gruesome night. He has suffered from PTSD through the years. John Jones stated, I had completely shut down to where all my energy was directed at the case. Aaron Moriarty asked, it took a toll on you, didn't it, John, even 30 years afterwards? Well, yeah, it would on anybody, I think. Not as much as the families, you understand, I know. Whatever pain I'm having pales in comparison to what they're going through. These days, Jones finds solace singing in his church choir. I can relax when I'm in the church. Aaron's asked, leave the world behind, to leave outside. No, I know it's just past the door. And when he's in that outside world, the families of Amy Ayers, Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, and Eliza Thomas are never far from his thoughts. I feel bad for them that it's still not solved. But Jones has hope. He has kept that shirt he wore the night of the murders, the shirt he promised to never wear until the case was solved. Aaron states 30 years later, it's still sitting there. John responds, it's still sitting there. It is. And sometime soon, John Jones looks forward to wearing it again. I just hope one of these days we can put this thing to bed for the family's sake. So, a lot of information there, and everything does seem to go back to the last two guys in the yogurt shop. Theoretically, the last individuals known to have seen the victims. So some more information here, also from CBS News. This was February 5th, 2022, by Stephanie Sliffer. Are two never identified customers key to solving Austin's yogurt shop murders? It has been 30 years since 4 teenage girls were murdered in Austin, Texas yogurt shop, and the case remains unsolved. At one point, there were arrests and convictions, but those convictions were later overturned on appeal. And ultimately, new DNA tech raised doubts about the involvement of those initial arrestees. The case has left investigators at what appears to be a standstill, but as correspondent Erin Moriarty reported in this week's 48 Hours, there's a theory that two never-identified men seen in the yogurt shop on the night of the murders may have been involved in the unsolved killings that have haunted Austin for decades. On December 6, 1991, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas, 13-year-old Amy Ayers, and two sisters, 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison and 15-year-old Sarah Harbison, were tied up and shot in the head in an I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop in Austin. The city had never seen a crime quite like it. Eliza and Jennifer had been working in the yogurt shop that night. They were getting ready to close when Jennifer's sister Sarah and their friend Amy met them there to head home. Investigators believe at least two men entered the shop and committed the brutal crime before setting the place on fire, destroying much of the evidence. John Jones worked for the Austin Police Department at the time of the crime and was the lead investigator in the case. He has since retired. Jones told Moriarty that part of the early investigation, he and his team tracked down customers who were in the yogurt shop on the day of the crime to see if they noticed anything suspicious. According to Jones, multiple customers described two men who looked out of place, sitting in the yogurt shop just before it was due to close. Neither man reported to have purchased a frozen yogurt, instead, only a drink. They have never been identified. And we did everything. We even hypnotized some folks, Jones told Moriarty. The article then goes on to mention the court cases and such. I'll skip over that because we just went over that. Continuing on here, attorney Amber Farrelly worked on both Scott and Springsteen's defense teams. She is adamant that police had it all wrong when they arrested Scott and Springsteen, Wellborn and Pierce. She told 48 Hours she believes those two unidentified customers from the yogurt shop are who police should really be fixated on. While working on Scott and Springsteen's defense teams, Farrelly was asked with sifting through old police records, including those interviews Jones and his colleagues had conducted with customers who visited the yogurt shop on the day of the murders. They, the police, have accounted for and interviewed 52 people who were in that yogurt shop that day, Farrelly told the 48 Hours, Erin Moriarty. Farrelly says several of those customers mentioned the two men who were sitting in the yogurt shop just before it was due to close that night. We have no names to them, and when you look at it, when you step back and you look and you think, they've talked to 52 people and didn't miss one person from 4:30 till 11 at night. And several people talk about a guy or two guys and they describe them in the same manner, and we don't know who those two guys are, and they've never called it in. That raises, in my opinion, the suspicion that these are the gentlemen who did it, Farrelly said. Were those two men who've never been identified the last people in the yogurt shop As far as you know, Moriarty asked Farrelly. Absolutely, Farrelly responded. Farrelly says the men were described as kind of leaned over the table, talking to each other and kind of whispering like they didn't want anybody to hear what they were saying. She says one of the men was described as having light short hair, like a dirty blonde, and was said to have been about 5'6", late 20s, early 30s. She says the other man was described as being bigger, and both were observed wearing big coats. One, she says, is thought to have had a green army fatigue kind of looking jacket, and the other is thought to have had a black jacket. According to Farrelly, the men are believed to have been driving a green car that evening. John Jones, the former lead investigator in the case, is still haunted by the unsolved yogurt shop murders, even though he is long retired. He told 48 Hours he still wonders about those unidentified customers. Yeah, it's kind of a question to me that to this day they haven't been identified, he said. Is that evidence they did it? No. But that's evidence that we really need to talk to them. I mean, that's quite the understatement. I mean, these are the last known individuals to have been in the vicinity of the victims. The last known to have seen the victims. I mean, this is where all of the focus should be. Alright, so let's get into the mind shocks here. So apparently, there's actually further unpublicized evidence. They actually recovered even more DNA. They recovered 2 more DNA profiles from the Harbison sisters, 1 from each. Let's look at this clip all the way back. I don't know why this isn't mentioned in 2022. Anything in 2022, all this recent information. But on April 27th, 2016, KXAN News aired this clip, or at least this is when they put it on their YouTube. Attorney of man accused of yogurt shop murders on unpublicized evidence. And here's the clip here. Let's take a look at it.
After sitting on death row, Robert Springsteen's attorneys today made another attempt to get his name officially cleared in the 1991 yogurt shop murders.
They made 20-minute oral arguments this morning in the Court of Appeals to ask for a hearing. That hearing would allow them to prove his innocence, they say, and have it declared on record. The Travis County prosecutors were also there to make their argument. They say Springsteen is still a suspect. If he's ever declared innocent, Springsteen could receive more than $700,000. His attorneys say there is much more to it.
It's not just money at stake. This is hanging over his head like the sword of Damocles. This is, every morning he has to wake up, it's there.
Springsteen was one of 2 men convicted of the murders, only to have the conviction overturned. Michael Scott is also trying to move on with his life. Chris Sadeghi spoke with his attorney about this case, his client, and evidence he says has not been publicized.
Mind you, I haven't seen this in, I don't know, since '09, I guess.
He dug up old files, looked through them again. But the words yogurt shop always stick with attorney Tony Diaz.
But for me,
not just for the brutal murder of 4 young girls, but also what happened to 4 young men.
I'm 58 years old, and I don't think I've ever seen anything like this.
Milestone in the defense of Mike Scott.
He was there beside Michael Scott 7 years ago when he walked from jail after DNA led to dismissed charges, and there with Scott's family at Wednesday's hearing. In his office is a picture of Scott's equivalency diploma and his new life.
Please don't count Mike out, because I am convinced that he's innocent.
He shared with us why.
But this is infallible. The public hasn't seen this, and they don't want him to see it.
Still sharp in his mind and laid out in a PowerPoint is the DNA evidence taken from victim Amy Ayers that did not match Scott, Robert Springsteen, or anyone. But because they've not retried the case, Diaz says more DNA evidence has never been heard. Evidence from the Harbison sisters showing 2 other profiles that also did not match known suspects.
It's enough that you have 1, but here we have 3.
Though charges were dropped, the DA's office still considers Scott and Springsteen suspects. Diaz thinks it's a way to avoid the embarrassment of the DNA evidence at trial and also avoid the cost of exoneration.
To say that they're still suspects, yet not pursue them, is, I think, almost tantamount to an act of cowardice.
Chris Sadeghi, KXAN News.
We checked to see how much money the Texas Comptroller's Office has paid out to people who were wrongfully convicted. From 1992 through the 2016 fiscal year, the state has paid out $69 million. In 2015, $2.7 million was paid, and that's about the same as in 2014. The Comptroller's Office says the money comes from the General Money Appropriations Fund.
So, wow. So there's 3 profiles. There's 3 DNA profiles. None of the 3 match any of these 4 guys. So, but this is weird now. So the 2 men last known in the shop, how could there be 3 profiles if there's only 2 killers or 2 perpetrators? Unless these samples are so degraded. I mean, we do have to keep that in mind. Is it, I mean, again, we really don't know, but if we take at face value that these indeed are 3 different DNA samples of 3 different individuals, I mean, is there another possibility? So there's a sample from each of the Harbinger sisters. Yeah, that's tough. That's tough. So now we have 3 different samples. I don't know what to make of that. So because there was arson involved, I mean, we'd be remiss not to possibly go over the theory that the yogurt shop owners might have wanted to burn it down for insurance money, but that obviously, I mean, is it possibly they hired some people to do this, people who thought they didn't, and these shady people, they see these teenage girls and they decide, oh, well, we're burning this place down anyway, let's add some rape and murder to the mayhem since they're scumbag criminals. And yogurt shop owners didn't know that they were going to do that. Again, I'm not alleging any of this is true or untrue, but the yogurt shop owners did put up sizable rewards and then increased the rewards. I'm assuming the police looked into them. But just another theory I haven't really seen discussed, at least not yet. We do have a lot more to go over here. There are a few more details. Let's look at how the girls came to be in the shop and the possibility that some of them were followed. So this is an article from Statesman.com. Yogurt shop murders forever in our hearts 30 years later. Austin still without answers on murdered teen girls. By Chuck Lindell, Tony Plateski, and Katie Hall. December 3rd, 2021. Experts say any break in the Austin's yogurt shop murders case likely will come from a confession from the killer or someone who knew the killer. So they don't appear to be putting faith in the DNA. I'm going to skip down. I'm going to skip through the article here regarding, again, the trials and the court cases and all the issues there that we already went over. But the evidence here, before the yogurt shop case went cold, leads and clues hard to come by. A couple who bought frozen yogurt told police that one of the victims locked the door behind them as they left that Friday night near closing time. Okay, so this is kind of a problem because then is it not clear that the 2 unidentified patrons of this yogurt shop establishment, did they leave also? And this other couple left after them, or did they leave it around the same time? Because a couple stating here that the door was locked behind them as they left Friday night. So there's no way they would lock the door if the other 2 guys were still there. So we have a lot of conflicting evidence here. I mean, this is a problem with a lot of these cases if you can't verify this. At 11:47 p.m., a police officer on patrol reported a fire at the shop. The front door was still locked. The back door was not. Investigators who found no sign of forced entry suspected multiple people took part in robbing the shop and then killing the girls. While the families mourned and the city struggled with the enormity of the crime, police received their first confession that same month. A teenage girl said she and her boyfriend committed the crime. The confession proved false. Okay, wow. How often does a teenage girl make a confession that she and her boyfriend committed the crime? And again, if there is some kind of love triangle or jealousy involved here, is it possible it's some kind of murder for hire? But so they said the confession proved false. It would be interesting to know how they determined that. But apparently we have 3 sets of male DNA profiles. We have 3 different profiles, so 3 men involved allegedly, unless there's some kind of problem with the DNA extraction and it was degraded and it was really only 2. And for some reason, it looks like a 3rd. But again, in the time scale, if this is quick, if this all happened quickly and 3 of the girls were sexually assaulted, I mean, for one guy to do all that, is it possible? Theoretically, I guess you could say it's possible, but if there were three perpetrators, it would definitely make it easier to get away in a quick fashion. In August 92, Austin police began searching for three men who had been indicted in an unrelated abduction and sexual assault, saying they wanted to question them in the yogurt shop murders. With much fanfare, Mexican authorities announced 2 months later they arrested two of the men, saying both would be charged with the Austin murders after one had confessed. What about the third guy, though? Whatever happened to that guy? The confession, however, was later recanted as the suspect accused Mexican authorities of torture. So this was a formal accusation of torture. That lead dried up as well. By the 2-year anniversary of the murders, police had investigated more than 5,000 leads. They still had made no arrests on the case. The victims gone for so long, girls' families continue to mourn. Barbara Ayers Wilson lost 2 daughters that night. My children have been gone for so long, she said in a recent interview with the American Statesman. I have memories of them, but they are fleeting as I get older. I think more now about when I will join them. Each of the girls shared a love of animals, particularly of horses and lambs. They gravitated to the same Future Farmers of America chapter where friendships quickly bloomed. Jennifer Harbison, 17, was a senior at Lanier High School, while her 15-year-old sister Sarah was a freshman on the same campus on Peyton Gin Road in North Austin. I'm assuming they investigated this Future Farmers of America chapter. They investigated the high school. Because again, just FBI statistics, whenever a female is harmed or killed, she is known to the murderer or the attacker. It's not usually a stranger crime. That's a rarity. Then again, a case like this is a rarity in and of itself, so this could be one of these rare cases, but you can't assume it was someone not known to them. You have to investigate all angles, particularly those statistically more likely in general when there's an absence of leads. The Harbisons spent their early childhoods in Texarkana, but moved to Austin with their mother after their parents divorced. They had attended private Catholic school but transferred to Lanier High. Along with being active in the school's FFA chapter, both were athletes. Jennifer ran track while Sarah competed on the school's volleyball and basketball teams. Jennifer's parents had recently purchased a car for her, but with the condition that she get a job to help make payments. That's why she worked at the yogurt shop. Eliza Thomas, also a 17-year-old Lanier senior, had similarly begun working at the store to make extra money. She had joined Lanier's FFA chapter and participated in the school's welding and agriculture program. I mean, these are some solid programs at high schools. I mean, there's not a lot of high schools that have these programs, at least in many parts of the U.S. Amy Ayers, the youngest victim, was a Burnett Middle School student, but also participated in Lanier's FFA program. So this program is the link between all of the girls. That's how she became friends with Sarah. On the night of the murder, Amy was going to spend the night at the Harbison home. She and Sarah had been together at North Cross Mall and walked 10 minutes to the yogurt shop to ride home with Jennifer. Okay, so is it a theoretical possibility that someone saw them at the mall and followed them from there? 30 years later, Amy's brother and sister-in-law, Sean and Angie Ayers, still celebrate her birthday, often making a cake at home or sharing a restaurant dessert in her honor. Everybody got cheated. Angie Ayers told the Statesman recently, I think we would all be riding horses together. Would your kids be friends? Think of everything we missed. If she had gone to college, marriage, you can't get any of that back. So there's an interesting point here. 8 days after the murders, Austin police arrested 16-year-old Maurice Pierce with a .22 cal revolver at the North Cross Mall a few blocks east of the yogurt shop. So this North Cross Mall is also where Amy and Sarah had been before going to the yogurt shop. I mean, no doubt a popular hangout in 1991. So Pierce said he loaned the gun to a friend, Forrest Wellborn, 15, who had used it in the yogurt shop murders and told him about it later. Also, is it possible Maurice was being truthful and that Forrest Wellborn did tell him that, but he just made it up? I mean, 15-year-old criminals flex about stuff all the time and brag about crimes they never did. Again, we have to keep in mind, these are 15 and 16-year-olds here. These are 15 and 16-year-old mentalities, possibly younger intellectually, who are criminals. Police investigated but rejected the claim, assuming it was an attempt to deflect attention from a charge of unlawfully carrying a weapon. See, that's a good point. Again, so this is a 16-year-old. Like, what is in his 16-year-old criminal mind, possibly intellectually and emotionally younger? What would he say to try to get out of this charge? The article then goes on, of course, document all of the court funny business and the coerced confessions and then the DNA evidence. Also, here more details. Robert Springsteen first told the detective during his 5-hour videotaped interrogation that he was never within 100 yards of the yogurt shop. Another interesting wrinkle here, in 2010, Pierce died after an Austin police officer shot him in a confrontation in North Austin after stopping him for a traffic violation. Pierce stabbed the officer who survived his injuries after years of what his family said was police harassment. So did he just snap because police were always harassing him? Now, he is a known criminal, so if he's a known criminal, again, I don't know what his rap sheet is, but if he's a known criminal or not, even if he's guilty of other crimes, would he snap if he's constantly being harassed for a crime he's actually had nothing to do with? And then they just went over the new DNA evidence that we already went over as well. Some more info from various sources. Jennifer Harbison not only was part of the Future Farmers of America, she was actually the president for her school's chapter of the FFA. Alright, let's dissect the timeline a little bit and possibly look at other suspects in the yogurt shop. So, from unresolved.me, referring to the Unresolved podcast, in their write-up on their website, they have some interesting information here. December 6, 1991 was a typical gray day in a series of them. It was the second to last Friday of the school semester. The kids throughout the Austin area were already preparing for the upcoming winter break. After leaving school that afternoon, 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison stopped by the apartment where her high school boyfriend, Sammy Buchanan, lived. Sammy had not been at school that day due to him having attended a family member's funeral, and the two would hang out for a few hours at the apartment. Jennifer would return home at around 7 p.m. to pick up her work clothes and then started heading to work. First, however, another question here. So she had a boyfriend and she visited her boyfriend. Is it possible if she's 17 years old visiting her boyfriend's apartment, is it possible the male DNA recovered could be his and therefore not one of the perpetrators? And there really could only be two perpetrators. Jennifer would return home 7 p.m., pick up work clothes, and then start heading to work. First, however, she had to pick up Sarah's best friend, Amy Ayers, and drop off the two at the mall just down the road from the yogurt shop. On the weekends, the mall was usually crawling with teenage boys and girls, those of the mall rat generation. 15-year-old Sarah and 13-year-old Amy would end up spending the evening at the North Cross Mall, which, as I said, was just down the road from the yogurt shop that Jennifer worked at, less than a half a mile away. At the time, the mall was one of the go-to hotspots for the area's teens in the relatively affluent northwestern corner of Austin, which was known for its movie theater and ice rink, both of which were staples of the teenage masses that would gather on Fridays and Saturdays. Okay. All right. So on this particular Friday, so if you're a serial killer or otherwise criminal and you want some teenage victims, these are hot spots to go pick out victims, one would think. This was actually the first time that anytime I see first time or something out of the ordinary, there's a problem here. This was the first time either Sarah or Amy had been able to go to the mall by themselves without older siblings or parents. And the two were planning to have a sleepover at Sarah's house that evening, riding back with Jennifer when she got off work. Okay, again, anytime something is out of the ordinary, you have to start looking at the coincidence stack. Who else would have known that as well? That night, best friends Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas, who were both 17 years old, were working the evening shift at I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. Eliza started her shift at 7 and Jennifer started at 8. And the two would be responsible for closing that store that evening. Over the next several hours, multiple customers would come and go from the yogurt shop, leaving behind scattered breadcrumbs of witness sightings that police would later have to compile together. Between 8:15 and 8:30, a woman named Lucella Jones dropped by the yogurt shop picking up some frozen yogurt for her husband who had just had dental surgery. She would later recall seeing two teenage boys sitting in a booth near the front door who were the only two customers in the shop at the time. Is that kind of weird too? So this is between 8:15 and 8:30 on a Friday night at a relative. Is this a poppin' yogurt shop or is it not? So at that time between 8:15 and 8:30, Lucella Jones is picking up yogurt and she's saying there were only two teenage boys in a booth near the front door. At the time, there were no other customers. Is that weird? They seemed to be engrossed in an item that was in the middle of the table, which seemed to be a bag or a sack of sorts, which could have been anything. The popular theory is that it was a sack of marbles. Both were regular-looking teenagers, but in this affluent corner of town, they appeared to be hoodlums. Jones would later describe them as having long, unkempt hair and appearing to be of Hispanic origins, although she couldn't be sure of their race. All she knew is that the two teenagers gave her a sense of unease, which would multiply in the years to come. Okay, so we have another two sets of suspects, or persons of interest at minimum, and so apparently this woman, Lucella Jones, is saying her intuition, she had a bad feeling, and it only got worse. So how much is that worth? You know what would also be weird? If those Mexican suspects, if they really were in the yogurt shop but didn't have anything to do with the crime, is that a possibility? Although, again, if there's only two people there between 8:15 and 8:30 on one of the busiest nights of the week, supposedly, Friday night, creeping up to winter break, I mean, unless absolutely everybody's at the mall. I mean, the mall is a little bit of a distance, not much. Less than half a mile. So not that far. But was it far enough? I mean, was there a yogurt shop at the mall or other shops at the mall? That's why this, I mean, again, unclear. Locals could clear that up that were living in the area in 1991. At around 9, 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison took a short break and drove down the street picking up her sister and her sister's friend from the North Cross Mall, which was closing. So the mall's closing at 9. Sarah and Amy returned to the yogurt shop with Jennifer, but would walk down a few doors to a nearby pizza shop called Mr. Gaddy's Pizza, which was closing at 10. They bought a pizza and brought it back to the yogurt shop, where multiple witnesses recall seeing them over the next hour or so eating the pizza in the lobby and being caught up in their conversation. At approximately 9:30, Eliza's mother, Maria Thomas, dropped by the yogurt shop as she and the other parents regularly did during the teens' weekend work shifts. She stayed there for a few minutes, bought some yogurt, and then left, believing that everything was fine. There were no other customers in the store at the time, and nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary when she left. Okay, so apparently it's not that poppin' on a Friday night at 9:30 p.m., 8 to 8:15 p.m. There's one anywhere between 2 and 0 patrons at the time. Okay, let's get into MINDSHOCK land. At some point between 9:30 and 10, a former military policeman and owner of a security firm named Daryl Croft dropped by with a couple of acquaintances. Inside the yogurt shop, Croft noticed two separate young couples, as well as an individual young man who appeared to be alone. Croft described the young man who had a deep voice and a large nose as being fidgety, especially when he spoke to Croft. The young man seemed perplexed by the vehicle Croft had parked in front of the yogurt shop, a security vehicle that had lights similar to a police cruiser. And the young man would express some weird behavior when placing his order, ordering a single can of soda, which he then took with him towards the bathroom in the back of the store, which Croft claims he never saw him leave by the time he left himself minutes later. Speaking to police at a later date, Daryl Croft would be unable to provide much more information about this young man or identify him in any kind of photo lineup. But he did claim that the young man was wearing a green jacket, which looked something that had been picked up from a military surplus store. So this is kind of weird, though, because apparently there's two unidentified guys. Is this young guy, is he not part of these two other guys, one of which also had some kind of army fatigues? Let's see if it's clarified here. Also, Daryl Croft, I mean, how many other people saw this other guy? Because if nobody else saw him, you'd have to assume, I mean, if this guy's shady and he's making up another shady person to cast suspicion away from himself, we have to keep that possibility in mind. Between 10 and 11, multiple witnesses would come into I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, but the final sale was registered at 10:42 to a couple that had just gotten out of a movie and wanted to grab some dessert before heading home. While purchasing their yogurt, this couple would report seeing a couple of individuals, who they believed to be men, sitting at the table closest to the cash register. So they weren't sure they were men? Is that because they had long hair or something? Both were wearing jackets or thick sweatshirts which obscured their faces, but one appeared to be bigger or more muscular, while the other appeared to be skinnier with thin features. Unfortunately, the couple would not get a good look at the pair, but had little reason to believe they needed to. The yogurt shop was scheduled to close at 11, and by the time the two witnesses left at approximately 10:47, one of the teenage employees had already started to wipe down the tables and place chairs on top of the tables. It would later be reported that the two chairs that the obscured men were sitting in close to the cash register would be the only chairs that remained on the floor. While Jennifer and Eliza were the only employees working that evening, it is believed that Sarah and Amy, Jennifer's younger sister and her friend, were helping out so that the teens could leave on time. The two were going to be catching a ride with Jennifer anyhow and likely wanted to get on with their sleepover. Besides, the two were regulars at the frozen yogurt shop and were already accustomed to helping out when they could. Witnesses did not recall seeing Sarah and Amy out in the lobby during the last half hour or so of the store's open hours, but it was believed that they might have moved to the back of the store to begin cleaning up there. That was where their pizza box would later be found, indicating that they had relocated to the back kitchen for at least a little while. The yogurt shop was scheduled to close at 11 p.m., and as the clock continued to creep closer to midnight, the teens' parents had no reason to suspect that anything had happened to them. After all, the four girls were in the same FFA chapter at Lanier High and regularly stopped by the school's off-campus site on North Lamar Boulevard to say goodnight to the animals they were raising. Eliza was raising a pig while the Harbison sisters were raising lambs. The teens dropped by at least twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening, and it was believed they might have dropped by the animal pens to care for them before heading home. I mean, is that a little dangerous? I guess in 1991, before any major crime in the city, I mean, I don't know. That's to be after 11 p.m. close time at the yogurt shop. They sometimes went to visit animals, just riding around at night that late. Just before midnight, Troy Gay, a young police officer with the APD that was patrolling Northwest Austin on the lookout for DWIs, happened upon the Hillside Center Strip Mall that I Can't Believe It's Yogurt was located in. Almost immediately, he noticed that smoke was coming from the yogurt shop itself and that he would call in dispatch at 11:47 p.m. Even though it was believed that this might be a simple kitchen fire, the call would spark an immediate response as not much else was going on in Austin that Friday evening. Fire crews would arrive at the location a short time later, with Renee Garza being one of the first firefighters on duty that weekend. Garza would later testify at showing up at the scene, noticing that the lights of the yogurt shop were off with a closed sign facing backward. As he approached the front door, though, he could see the blaze burning inside, with the black smoke filling in the confined space of the yogurt shop, obscuring everything in the building. As Garza and his fellow firemen prepared to move in, they popped open the front door with a crowbar, gaining access to the yogurt shop. They began battling the flames, which thankfully had been confined to a small enough location. Firefighters regarded the incident as a two-alarm fire, meaning that it was moderate enough to warrant a cautious response, but wasn't intense enough to begin spiraling out of control. Within a couple of minutes, the firefighters had started to quell the fire with water from their hoses and began to gain more visibility towards the back of the store. As the flames started to dwindle, Rene Garza's partner, David DeVal, grabbed him and pointed towards an object in the back of the yogurt shop, asking, "Is that a foot?" It was then that a horrifying discovery would be made, which would change not only the lives of everyone involved, but the city of Austin itself. Police officers at the scene made the call into authorities, eventually calling in Sergeant John Jones, who was being filmed inside of his vehicle by a local news network at the time. Even though the original call that came into dispatchers informed them that the 2 bodies had been found, that would quickly be amended to 3 bodies. And then, by the time Sergeant Jones arrived at the scene, 4 bodies. All had been discovered near the back door, with 3 of the bodies having been stacked on top of each other and then set ablaze. The 4th had been found just a few feet away, separated for some unknown reason. Even though the 4 bodies had been burned severely, to the point of being unrecognizable, it was clear that all 4 had been young women. Before being burned, they had been forced to undress and then bound and gagged with their own clothing, before being shot in the head execution style. It was unknown if all had been dead at the time they were set on fire, but that was the belief at the crime scene. Sergeant Jones, who had been the only homicide detective on duty that evening, was the first detective to arrive at the crime scene. It was now his case to handle, and after viewing the scene for just a moment, he stepped back outside to speak to the camera crew that had been filming with him that evening. He would have a hard time answering any of their questions as the severity of the crime scene began to dawn on him and the rest of the first responders. The victims would be identified as 4 teenage girls that had been inside the yogurt shop that evening: Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers. Police were able to identify Jennifer and Eliza through their vehicles in the yogurt shop parking lot, and then Sarah and Amy through simple process of elimination. Over the next couple days, it would be reported in the press that the 4 victims had been teenage girls, which undoubtedly added to the terrifying nature of the crime. Everyone saw their loved ones in the victims, their daughters, sisters, neighbors, classmates, or even themselves. In the years to come, many people would look back at this incident, which reporters soon began referring to as the Austin yogurt shop murders, as the turning point for the entire city of Austin. The idea that the city itself lost its innocence that weekend remains a topic of discussion among locals, who all believe it to be true to this day. This crime was shocking to everyone in the area, but was especially shocking to the members of the Austin Police Department, who had investigated similar crimes in the past, but nothing quite as brazen or as shocking as this. Sergeant Scott Carey of the APD told reporters that weekend, "I've been on the force 10 years and lived in Austin 20 years, and this is the worst I remember." At the crime scene, it was quickly discovered that the back door into the yogurt shop had been left unlocked. That was likely how the culprit or culprits had made their getaway, since the front door had been locked and the keys later found inside. I mean, I have to interject here again. So the couple that said that one of the girls locked the door behind them, would they lock the door with the other 2 guys still in the shop? Yeah, this is a problem. We don't have verification on that. Also, is it possible by that point one of the girls in the back had been held at gunpoint? Or did the guys sneak out the back, leaving the door unlocked so the shop was empty, so they felt safe locking the door, not realizing the back door was unlocked? I mean, these are the details that need to be deciphered, because this is all very problematic, because the chairs are still on the floor. What does that mean? The chairs where the last 2 guys were sitting, and yet there's also the testimony of the couple that one of the teenage girls locked the door behind them. That doesn't quite make sense. So the front door had been locked and the keys were found later inside. Police would not say whether or not the register had been tampered with or how, but it was later confirmed that a robbery had taken place. Following an audit, it would be determined that roughly $550 had been stolen from the yogurt shop, most of which came from the cash register itself. What does that mean? The last transaction in the register's log had come at 11:03 p.m. Uh-oh. Okay, this is weird, because in the other article, it stated it was, 10:40 something. 3 minutes after the shop was supposed to have been closed. 13 minutes after the front doors were usually locked. This transaction was a no sale, which indicated that the transaction had either been canceled or the no sale button had been pushed to simply open up the register drawer. This was likely when the shop had been robbed and had either been done by one of the teenage employees or the culprit or culprits themselves. A full-scale arson investigation would take place that weekend, which hoped to determine when exactly the fire had been started. It was reported that the fire had been started in the kitchen area, which is where the girls' bodies had been found. AFD arson investigator Melvin Stahl was tasked with investigating the fire itself, and would later state in his official report dated December 7th that the fire had started at approximately 11:42 p.m., more than 40 minutes after the store was supposed to have been closed, and exactly 39 minutes after the no sale had been recorded on the cash register. This implied that the culprit or culprits had remained in the building for about an hour before starting the fire that would end up destroying or contaminating most of the crime scene. This is absolutely terrifying because, I mean, it's so heartbreaking and heart-wrenching to even try to imagine that last hour of these girls' lives. I mean, it's tough. It would be reported that the fire had been burning so intensely and so hot that one of the victims' teeth had started to burn away. It would also be reported that the victims' bodies had started to melt into the floor of the yogurt shop, which makes it so miraculous that the firefighters were able to squash it so quickly before it spread into neighboring businesses or further destroyed the crime scene. The fire had even managed to melt some of the victims' jewelry, as well as containers of cleaning supplies and paint cans in the back storage room. However, because the firefighters had needed to use an excessive amount of water to kill the fire, a large amount of physical evidence had essentially washed away from the victims and the crime scene itself. This would cause an untold amount of damage to the investigation, but that's something we'll explore later. It would later be theorized that styrofoam cups of lighter fluid had been placed on or near the bodies, which helped light the fire and increase the spread of the flames. Styrofoam itself is or was incredibly flammable, and when set on fire would create an almost napalm-like substance, which would burn incredibly hot and stick like tar to whatever it was placed on top of. In this case, that was the bodies of 4 murdered teenagers. In the years since, it's been speculated that lighter fluid wasn't even necessarily used at the crime scene itself, since the styrofoam itself, when stacked together and set on fire, would create an effect similar to lighter fluid. The burn marks discovered on the floor of the yogurt shop, which investigators attributed to lighter fluid, might have simply been the after effects of old styrofoam burning intensely. It was believed that the person or persons responsible for this crime had started the fire knowing full well what the substances involved would do to the crime scene, indicating some prior experience with starting fires. As you can imagine, that information would impact a large chunk of the investigation moving forward. So maybe not a 15-year-old in 1991? Presumably with no access to the internet, which was in its infancy. In addition to lighting a fire to destroy whatever physical evidence had been left behind, police would learn that the culprit or culprits had done whatever they could to contaminate the crime scene. On the bodies of the 4 murdered teenagers, the responsible parties had stacked a large number of paper cups and bowls from the yogurt shop, which acted as an accelerant for the flames. But in addition to that, police also discovered that chocolate syrup and other yogurt ingredients had been placed on or around the bodies, likely meant to mix with the blood and contaminate the crime scene. It would even be theorized that this might have been some kind of sick joke by the killer or killers. Police speculated that this crime had started as a robbery which had taken place during the closing of the yogurt shop. Investigators came to the conclusion due to the cleaning supplies that had been seemingly abandoned in the middle of the store's closing procedures. One of the rags that one of the teens had been using to wipe down the tables had been seemingly dropped and forgotten about. And the same thing had happened to one of the frozen yogurt dispensers, which were changed every night during closing. So, did the would-be burglars, or actual burglars, they came in through the back then, since the front door was locked, so they surprised and robbed them from the back door? Sergeant Mike Huckabee of the Austin Police Department verified this 2 days after the murders on December 8th when he told reporters, quote, "It appears they were closing and in the process of cleaning up. I would say they were probably killed one after the other. They appeared to be where they were shot," end quote. Despite the victims being found undressed and bound in their own clothing, it was not believed that they had been sexually assaulted, at least not in the early days of the investigation, as the autopsies were carried out by local medical examiners. As the autopsies themselves took place, DAs moved quickly to seal those reports, hoping to keep specific details from being released to the public. Despite that, though, it was publicly theorized that more than one culprit had been involved in the commission of the crime. Evidence left behind at the crime scene indicated more than one offender, which they had tried to destroy with the fire. But according to APD Lieutenant Andrew Waters, they had been unsuccessful in destroying all of the physical evidence. For example, police had learned that more than one firearm had been used in the commission of this crime, small caliber weapons, and that the fire had been started with materials found inside the store. Additionally, it was not believed that the offenders had forced their way inside, meaning they had likely been inside of the yogurt shop near its closing time, which would narrow in a timeline for investigators. police began reaching out to people in the area that might have seen or heard something from the evening in question. They were also hoping that those that had been in the yogurt shop in the hours before its closure would come forward, as they might have encountered the offender or offenders and could provide information that was invaluable to them and the victim's loved ones. Although, furthermore, if that one sketchy guy that went to the bathroom and possibly propped open that back door, if he left and he was just used by the true killers, and the true killers were not in the yogurt shop, they could have been elsewhere, and they had this guy kind of come in and prop open the back door for them. Maybe this guy then ran away and was not involved in anything further, thinking that he was just assisting in a standard burglary. And maybe he wouldn't have even wanted to assist if he knew it would be anything else. I mean, who knows? Either way, it seems like this guy was never identified anyway. In the days after this crime, Bryce Foods, the company that owned the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt chain of restaurants, put together a $25,000 reward for info leading to the arrest and conviction of those that had committed this heinous crime. The owners would even meet with the victims' families that weekend, hoping to do whatever they could to support them through this tragic time. By Monday, word had spread throughout the area, and Lanier High School, which was attended by 3 out of the 4 victims, had lost its cheerful edge. Students that had been excited about winter break just days prior now had to adjust to life without 3 of their peers, all of whom had been lost in a single vicious and unexplained stroke. Counselors met with students on their first days back to school and were greeted by a lot of anger and frustrations as these teenagers struggled to come to grips with their new reality. Paul Turner, the principal of Lanier, told the press that week, "This is something that's going to reach far. These were 2 seniors and 1 freshman, so it's going to hit a good number of kids. They will be grieving, they will be angry, there will be different feelings that they have, and we want to be ready to work with them in a compassionate, understanding way." Even though Burnett Middle School was less heavily impacted, the loss of 13-year-old Amy Ayers left a gaping hole in the hearts of her friends and teachers who just couldn't believe that she was truly gone. One of Amy's friends, 14-year-old Terry Becker, told reporters with the Austin American-Statesman that she hadn't believed the news and had gone to the yogurt shop that Saturday only to be greeted by the bustling crime scene. "When I went to the yogurt shop, it was like a hole being driven into my heart. I've lost one of my closest friends, and I'll never see her again." Like Lanier High School, Burnett Middle School had counselors on hand for the week after the murders in order to provide support that those who might need it. A vigil for all 4 victims was held that Monday, December 9th, at the St. Louis Catholic Church that all 4 girls had attended prior. More than 1,000 people showed up from the area to show support and love for the victims' families, who struggled to come to grips with this immense loss in their lives. A second vigil would take place exactly 1 week after the murders themselves at the yogurt shop itself. Those in attendance recognized a moment of silence and paid their respects to the 4 victims whose deaths were still clouded in mystery. In the days after the murders, police had been inundated with tips from the public. This was both pertinent and non-essential information from people who believed they knew something. Of these tips, police decided to narrow in on people who had been in the yogurt shop in the hours before the crime itself took place and began to arrange interviews with those witnesses. In the meantime, police began to explore the backstories of the 4 victims themselves, curious to see if any of the 4 teenagers had any kind of skeletons in their closets, anything like a jealous older ex-boyfriend or anything like that. However, there was nothing like that for any of the victims. All 4 were squeaky clean good girls that worked hard and had promising futures ahead of them. Police could find absolutely nothing indicating any kind of connection to suspicious individuals. Whatever had happened that night seemed to have been completely random. Again, it might have started at the mall, however, or even the pizza place. As police began to extend their search for witnesses, they began to learn more about what had happened that night to the 4 girls. After several days, the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office finished up their autopsy and released their findings to investigators. It was revealed that the 3 bodies were burned beyond recognition. These were the 3 bodies that had been stacked on top of each other, which were believed to be the 3 oldest victims, Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, as well as Eliza Thomas. Even though their bodies had been burned severely, MEs were able to identify through dental records. In their findings, it was also revealed that the youngest victim, Amy Ayers, had been the victim found several feet away from the others. According to some reports, she had been alive at the time the firefighters arrived at the scene, but just barely, perishing moments after they arrived. Supposedly, she had been attempting to crawl away from the flames towards the back door, where she was eventually found, but her injuries were just too much to bear. Each of the victims had been shot at least once in the head execution style, but it was later determined that the youngest victim, Amy Ayers, had been shot twice in the back of the head. So she was shot twice, survived, lit on fire, survived for a short period of time, and then died. Most peculiar, she had been shot with a different caliber weapon than the others, which cemented the notion that at least 2 separate individuals had been involved. So the other 3 were all shot with one gun, and she was shot with the other. Huh. And they can theorize, but would they not know at which time she was shot? I mean, presumably, how far away from the flames with this much styrofoam and possible additional accelerant or not, would the perpetrators want to be close? Is it possible they shot her after she crawled away, but then they would still have to be in there? So yeah, that doesn't make sense, especially if they know that she was shot from the back, then they wouldn't have been at the door or outside. On the other hand, what's the likelihood she survived 2 shots, not 1, but 2 shots in that? Or was she shot once in the head? Yeah, they still wouldn't be inside the shop, though, unless they came back inside. But why would they come back inside? Yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Even though the original police report indicated that this was a simple robbery murder with no kind of sexual component, it's been theorized over the years that at least one of the victims had been raped before their murders. It was speculated that this had been the youngest victim, Amy Ayers, whose body was found away from the others, but over the years this continued to evolve to the theory that more than one victim had been sexually assaulted at the scene. It would later come to light that investigators had questioned Jennifer Harbison's boyfriend, Sammy Buchanan, because they found his DNA at the crime scene. However, it would later be determined that he and Jennifer had started having sex in the weeks before her murder, and the two had done so right before she went to work. So my theory about that was correct. So out of the 3 DNA profiles, one profile did they determine that it was truly Sammy Buchanan? Huh. In which case, it might still only be 2 perpetrators in this crime. A lot of this information, which came from the autopsy findings, would be revealed years later after the case had already gone cold. That's because from the very beginning of this investigation, the Travis County DA had petitioned for the autopsy results to be sealed. They believed that the information from the autopsy could be used to confirm or reject potential confessions, which always come flooding in after high-profile cases reach the media. And it was believed that this was necessary in this case, especially since a lot of the physical evidence had been destroyed by the fire and then further contaminated from the water from the fire hoses. Travis County DA Judge John Wisser allowed the reports to be sealed so that confidentiality could be preserved not only for the victims and their loved ones, but also so that the investigation itself could become insulated by outside influences. He allowed the reports to be sealed until someone was arrested and charged with the murders, which would prove to be in the distant future. Okay, so we're about to have some more possible leads here. Police began to expand their search out into the local area, wondering if perhaps this crime was connected to others from the neighborhood. In the months prior, multiple robberies had taken place in the Hillside Center strip mall that I can't believe its yogurt was located in. This included multiple robberies at Suzanne's, a clothing store next door, which had been broken into approximately 8 times in the preceding months. It had become such a problem that Suzanne's had to put bars on their windows to prevent further burglaries. Okay, all right. This is just crazy. And they think it's okay for these young teenage girls to be locking up alone near midnight after all these robberies? I mean, 8 times? 8 times? Right next door? I mean, and they can't find those guys? There's no witnesses to any of those guys? Because, I mean, what are the chances it's not those guys? Sandra Tash, the owner of a pet grooming salon a few doors down, believed that the area's robberies had likely played a part in the yogurt shop murders, as it was one of the few remaining shops open in the area at that late hour. She theorized that the culprits had likely ended up there because all of the neighboring businesses were closed. Police also looked into possible connections to a murder that had taken place a few months prior. It looks like crime is really ramping up in this area. We have a murder and a whole bunch of burglaries right in that area. In that case, a woman from Buda had been abducted outside of a country western nightclub about 2 blocks away from the yogurt shop, and her body was later found. That case was still unsolved at the time, and police unsuccessfully tried to link the two together. So I actually can't find any other information here. This woman from Buda, 2 blocks away? There was also a woman abducted from a downtown car wash and killed, and the suspect was serial killer Kenneth McDuff. Huh. So we have a few months before murder, a few weeks after another murder. Yeah, this is weird. I can't find anything at all about this case from the country western nightclub 2 blocks away from the yogurt shop. It was continuing on here, though. It was reported that investigators in Austin had reached out to officials in Las Cruces, New Mexico, where a similar crime had unfolded at a bowling alley the year prior, 1990. That incident, Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre, was in an episode of Unresolved last year. Explored all of its gory, tragic details, the brutal shooting deaths of multiple witnesses who had been shot in the head and left for dead. Just like in this case, the offenders had started a fire to cover up the crime by destroying any evidence, while the culprits made off with cash from the robbery. Just like this case, it remains unsolved to this day. Wow, I definitely never heard of that one. The Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre of 1990. But the theory proliferated that most of the early reporting on this case was the possibility that this crime had some kind of drug connection. Speaking to KLBJ Radio that first weekend, Sergeant John Jones, the detective overseeing the case, speculated that most of the police department agreed that the girls were robbed at around closing time and that drugs had played a part in that. He theorized that the offenders might have been high at the time because of the chaotic crime scene they left behind. This would be repeated by APD Sergeant Mike Huckabee that same weekend, who spoke with reporters on December 8th. Just like Sergeant Jones, Huckabee believed that the culprits had either been under the influence of narcotics at the time of the crime or hoped to use the profits from it to procure them. Quote, "The first thing that comes to mind is crack cocaine. I've been in homicide a pretty good time, and this is the worst one I've seen, considering it involved 4 young ladies at the same time," end quote. In the latter half of December, police released a profile of the killers, which had been created with help from the FBI. This profile, which explored who the potential culprits might have been, also explained whether or not the public was at risk for any kind of follow-up crimes. According to the profile, the culprits of the crime did not plan it out, but they were familiar with the area, due to their quick getaway and their ability to successfully navigate away from the crime scene without alerting the police. They were not at risk to strike again, but were dangerous enough to commit this crime when desperate. Just another thought here, too, on the young squirrely guy who the security guard, or the guy that worked for the security company, he had some kind of vehicle that looked like a cop car, and this squirrely guy seemed to be asking him questions about it, like he was getting nervous. I mean, does that point to his involvement? And why did the security guy not see the other guy? So if this young squirrely guy is not part of the other 2 guys that were there, I mean, a lot of this doesn't make sense. So again here, they were not at risk to strike again, but were dangerous enough to commit this crime when desperate. At least 2 individuals had been involved in the commission of this crime, with the leader of the group being a dominant personality, someone who was able to coax at least one other individual into participating. That person, the follower, was likely to be extremely remorseful and was likely to come forward with answers in the future. It was also likely the offender or offenders had a history of other fire-related crimes, at times using arson to cover up other violent incidents. They undoubtedly had a history of starting fires and probably had a criminal record reflecting that. Also, the other thing that's weird, okay, it's 1991, so not a lot of true crime shows on TV, that's fine. But these robbers, I mean, they're hitting this store next door 8 times? 8 times? They just keep coming back and robbing the same store? Or is it postulated that there's different robbers, but they all want that particular store? I mean, that's just kind of weird. They just keep coming back, so how smart could they be? But on the other hand, they can start this fire with styrofoam and destroy evidence. I mean, there's a lot here that doesn't quite add up. Unless these guys are not the guys that robbed the store next door 8 times. In the weeks after the murders, it seemed like Austin itself had lost its innocence. At least that's what people in the area would say repeatedly as they struggled to come to grips with what had happened. The lives of 4 teenagers had been lost in a single night, and too many people in Austin who had grown up in the area or had relocated from other high-population areas to get away from violent crime. This was a drastic wake-up call. It was a reminder that incidents like this could happen anywhere, including Austin, which had a population of around 500,000 people at the time, but never felt like it. Yeah, so 500,000 people, that's a whole lot of people. Also, again, in that same strip mall, you have a store robbed 8 times right next door. Now the veneer of safety was gone. Something like this happened in a relatively affluent area, and it happened to the most vulnerable population among us, children. Because of that, panic began to creep into the bones of everyone in the area, especially in other businesses where teenagers worked similar hours at similar jobs. Parents that had once pressured kids into this late-hour jobs to try to teach them responsibility began to regret their decisions immediately. Businesses in the area began to ramp up their safety standards, not allowing employees to walk out to their cars alone after dark. Other employers began to lock exterior doors to closing time, increase the number of employees during night shift, and began overhauling regular procedures to make it safer for everyone, not just their younger female employees. In some cases, businesses began to employ security guards who were being hired in record numbers throughout Austin. Even gun shop owners who had started selling an influx of firearms were being inundated with calls from local business owners asking about the legality of keeping a weapon in their store. Statistically, Austin was much safer than many other areas in the U.S. To this day, it is regarded as a safe city, but it is not what many people in Austin felt at the time. Barbara Sirachi, the mother of victims Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, spoke to People magazine in 1992 and asked, quote, "What did we do wrong here? We moved to a nice house in a nice neighborhood. We did all the middle-class American things you can do to protect your family and make it wholesome and right. If this can happen to us, it can happen to anyone," end quote. People in Austin felt like this crime had changed the city and that that sentiment is shared to this day. To many, the sense of innocence they had once felt living in the middle of Texas was forever shattered, and they began waiting for detectives to present answers in the form of a suspect that the city could band together against. But as weeks began to stretch into months, it became clear that answers were not readily available, and the uneasiness that this case inspired would continue to linger. Also here on Unresolved, they did go on to clarify Maurice Pierce, the first guy that allegedly confessed. He actually dropped out in middle school. So even though he was 15 or 16, I see both numbers here, he basically had a much younger mental age. And apparently not only that, but he also might have had another undiagnosed mental condition. So if he had, again, mental issues, you can't take that confession seriously. And John Jones wrote that Pierce was lying and just made the whole story up about the gun being used. Sergeant Jones would speak to the press about this confession and others which had started to inundate himself and other investigators. Confessions sound good, but that's not the standard by which charges are filed. If we have the right person, we will charge them. A confession alone isn't enough to get a conviction on. The killers have to tell us certain things that only the killers would know. That didn't happen in this case. They started telling us stuff that wasn't true. They were giving us information they had heard off the street, end quote. Here, in this write-up, it's stating police stated that more than 50 people falsely confessed. That's a lot of people. And Hector Polanco, the detective known for false confessions, he was later removed from the yogurt shop murders task force, and he was eventually fired from APD. He was eventually reinstated through an arduous arbitration process, which generally favors police officers. Wow, that's messed up. Now here's another cryptic issue here. Early January, members of the Austin Police Department began making positive statements to the press claiming that the investigation was preparing to come to an end. According to several members of the APD, they had been aided in their investigation by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, who hadn't pitched in on a case in Austin in over 2 decades, but had just recently been profiled in the hit movie The Silence of the Lambs. Now, supposedly, police were ready to make arrests. On January 3rd, 1992, the first Friday of the year, Sergeant John Jones told reporters, quote, "It would be safe to say an apprehension is imminent. We're really confident that this case will come to an end real soon," end quote. What's he talking about here? However, that claim would be backtracked the following Monday, January 6th, which also happened to be the 1-month anniversary of the crime itself. At a press conference announcing the official creation of a task force comprised of local, regional, state, and federal police, officials stated that no arrest was imminent, but they were hoping to find justice for the victims relatively soon. During the press conference, officials would release more comprehensive profile on the culprits as they continued to believe that a group of young men had been responsible. Either teenagers or men in their early 20s who were most likely white. The psychological profile had been created, narrowed in on the leader of the group who investigators believed had been the dominant personality among them. According to this profile, the leader of this group likely had less than a high school education, had a history of discipline problems, both anger issues and substance abuse issues, as well as acting out without considering the potential ramifications, avoided fights or confrontations that he may lose, likely only lashing out when he had strength in numbers, had a history of unemployment, or had to change jobs often because of his unreliability and volatile personality, still lived at home with his parents or some older parental figure, had a criminal record which may have included fire-related crimes, a history of abuse towards friends and loved ones, especially women, was familiar with the area around the yogurt shop, took very little pride in his personal appearance. Regarding this individual, Lieutenant Andrew Waters said, "He is under a tremendous amount of stress from fear of detection and apprehension because the commission of this crime may not have gone as planned. The offender is very concerned about the loyalty of his accomplices because he knows they regret their involvement in this crime," end quote. Throughout January and February, police in Austin would end up focusing a lot of their efforts on the local alternative community, people that seemed to have an interest in the occult or were self-professed Satanists. In reality, many of these people were just involved in Austin's underground Gothic and industrial movement, but because they wore black, had tattoos, and may have listened to heavy metal music at a time in which satanic panic was still very much alive throughout America, they were of extreme interest to the APD. Investigators began to refer to these individuals as PIBs, people or persons in black. Wow. In the weeks after the yogurt shop murders, police spent a lot of time investigating PIBs, believing that the murders might have had some kind of satanic cult angle. Although, you know what's weird, though? If there is no satanic cult angle, and this was just some burglars who were insane, if they were that smart, wouldn't they leave some kind of satanic objects at the scene just to frame this underground community? Because then the police would be chasing their tails, because they were chasing these people anyway. Throughout January and February, investigators would begin to harass several members of this underground community, attempting to get friend to testify against friend, grilling people in lengthy police interviews, and trying to figure out intimate details of these individuals' sex lives. One woman named Claire LaVey, I wonder if that's her real last name, was even accused of APD by being part of a satanic cult in the region that participated in illegal activities. 48 Hours had begun putting together a special about the case and were actually filming when police conducted a raid of LaVey's home, hoping to find proof of satanic sacrifices and grave robbing. The host of 48 Hours, Erin Moriarty, even referred to LaVey as a high priestess, which would turn out to be nothing more than a cringe-worthy accusation. The bones discovered in LaVey's house were little more than clay sculptures and animal bones, and the rumors of her having led a devil-worshipping cult were just that, silly rumors perpetuated by the same overzealous folks that perpetuated a lot of the satanic panic myths of the 80s and 90s. What's really crazy, though, is a lot of those weren't myths. I mean, there was a lot of satanic activity going on, and still continues to this day. Obviously, there's also a lot of non-satanic activity that gets labeled as such because of all the other real satanic activity, and obviously the stigma that's associated with it. There's a lot of goofs out there who actually maintain that there's zero satanic activity going on in this time period and even through to today. It's really weird, despite the documented satanic abuse and sacrifices and all that craziness. Members of this community would later express the belief that Austin police were trying to shut down their movement, having used the yogurt shop investigation as a cover to do so. And that belief would be granted some kind of backing when the police themselves announced that none of the persons in black were suspected of involvement in the yogurt shop murders. By March, police would announce that there was nothing cult-related about the crime scene, but they were unwilling to give up on any lead, no matter how zany or outlandish. Speaking to reporters with the Austin American-Statesman, Lieutenant Andrew Waters said, quote, "I wouldn't really say a satanic tie is still in our mind, but as far as ruling it out, absolutely ruling it out, I wouldn't say that," end quote. Several weeks after the investigation had started, the case began to receive national attention through a couple of high-profile broadcasts. First came an appearance in America's Most Wanted, hosted by John Walsh, which was then followed by an even more in-depth appearance on 48 Hours, hosted by the aforementioned Erin Moriarty. Here she is in a brief clip asking Sergeant John Jones about the active state of the investigation. As weeks dragged out into months, with no end in sight for the criminal investigation, the loved ones of the victims struggled to move on, especially since they had to do so without any kind of resolution. but with the gaping loss in their lives. First came what would have been Amy Ayer's 14th birthday on the final day of January 1992, which her family tried their best to celebrate. But the loss of the 4 girls continued to express itself in other ways with individuals outside of their families. For example, the FFA chapter that all 4 had belonged to at Lanier High School was now without its president and several of its members. Their duties had been delegated to other members who reluctantly stepped up into their positions on a temporary basis. Even the animals that the girls had been raising, some lambs and a pig, were now left orphaned by the loss of the girls. Other students would have to step up and care for the animals, aware that they could never explain the loss to the creatures. They were just this strange new nurturing presence in their lives. In June of '92, Jennifer and Eliza's classmates graduated from Lanier High, taking their first steps into a much larger world. The girls' absence was noted by a couple of empty seats at the ceremony, with their classmates acknowledging that even though the 2 girls couldn't walk with them, their presence would still be felt in the years to come. The loss of the 4 was impossible to comprehend for the victims' families. While Amy and Eliza's parents had other children that they could care for, their loss was felt heavily throughout those first few months as major holidays came and went. Then the major milestones, such as graduation and prom, which would have been joyous occasions but now felt empty and hollow. For Jennifer and Sarah's parents, the tragedy was twofold. Both sisters had been lost in a single evening, and neither of their parents had any other children. Meanwhile, the scene of the crime itself, the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop in the Hillside Center shopping center, would never reopen for business again. After being cleared by investigators, the interior of the store was left for weeks before being emptied. All the while, people in the area left mementos outside of the store in the form of candles, balloons, and written messages that were meant for the murdered girls. Within a week, the sign in front of the yogurt shop would be removed. What would follow was a long and arduous process of the building changing owners several times as the legacy of this crime continued to cast a large shadow over the area. In early February, a series of billboards would be erected throughout Austin, bearing the images of the 4 girls along with the question, who killed these girls? Throughout the rest of the year, the reward for information leading to the ID and apprehension of the culprit or culprits would continue to rise, first to $100,000, then to $125,000, eventually becoming the largest reward offered for any crime in the Austin area. In March '92, police began circulating a composite image of a young man who they believed had been seen in the area of the yogurt shop on the night of the murders. According to at least one witness, this young man had been seen inside an older model 4-door white automobile, which was believed to be a Chevy. This young man was described as standing roughly 5'4", weighing approximately 140 pounds, having long, straight, dark hair that reached past his neck, and being of possible Hispanic descent. How did they know how tall he was if he was sitting in the Chevy? I mean, I don't know. As soon as this sketch was released to the press, it began to draw media comparisons to a similar sketch that Austin police released just a few months prior, back in November '91, 1 month before the yogurt shop murders. In that case, 3 men had kidnapped a woman from outside of an Austin nightclub, driven her to an apartment complex just down the street from the yogurt shop, and then driven her to San Antonio, roughly 80 miles away. Throughout the entire ordeal, the woman had been sexually assaulted by the 3 men at gunpoint, and she would later describe them all to police. And this is a clearly different MO than the woman who was kidnapped and then murdered from that the nightclub a few blocks away. Because these guys didn't kill this victim. One of the 3 men was the sketch that was almost identical to the most recent one released to the press. A young man of similar proportions with long dark hair who appeared Native American in appearance but spoke fluent Spanish. Mexican authorities would later identify the individual from the composite images as Albert Jimenez Cortez, aka the Wizard. He was a member of the Mierdas Punks, a Mexican motorcycle gang, 3 of whom were believed to have committed the kidnapping and rape of the woman from Austin in November '91. The leader of this trio was a man named Porfirio Villa Saavedra, aka the Terminator, who, alongside Cortez, had acted alongside another man, Ricardo Hernandez, a.k.a. El Brujo. All had left the Austin area shortly after the yogurt shop murders and were believed to have fled to Mexico. Now, I want the exact timeline here, because if there's no exact timeline, because they kidnapped and assaulted this woman, but then they remained in Austin until the yogurt shop murders, or did they lay low and then happen to leave because of the woman they assaulted? Nothing to do with the yogurt shop murders. It was just coincidental. I mean, we need those exact details, but I mean, I guess they don't have them. I mean, they don't know the exact date they left, but they were believed to have fled to Mexico shortly after. Saavedra and Cortez were arrested by Mexican authorities in October 92 and were charged with the rape kidnapping from November 91, in addition to other crimes such as drug trafficking. Because they were Mexican nationals that were in Mexico at the time, they could not be extradited to the United States, but they could still stand trial for crimes they had committed across the border. I mean, how does that work, though? Like, what's the legality of that? However, during their initial questioning, both had supposedly confessed to involvement in the Austin yogurt shop murders, which were still completely unsolved. Because one of the men, Cortez, looked like a composite image released by police in that crime, Mexican authorities were sure that this trio had been responsible. A trial began within weeks for the rape case and some of the other charges, but neither Saavedra or Cortez would ever be charged for the Austin yogurt shop murders. Primarily because there was no evidence linking them to the crime. The composite image released by the police was just someone that had supposedly been seen in the parking lot that night, and APD had never named him a suspect nor positively ID'd Cortez as this individual. And you know what's curious? The person who was the source of the composite sketch, I mean, you would think they would be shown a photo or even an in-person lineup of Cortez to see if they could identify him. But again, if it was poor lighting conditions in the parking lot, they might not be able to either way. But also because both men had recanted their confessions almost immediately. They claimed that they'd been tortured by Mexican police during their interrogations and had nothing to do with the yogurt shop crime. Investigators would travel to Mexico on multiple occasions over the next couple of years so that they could meet with detectives down there and interview these two men for themselves, but they were never able to find anything directly linking them to the yogurt shop murders. The two men, Albert Jimenez Cortez and Porfirio Villa Saavedra, would be convicted for other crimes but would never stand trial in this case. Meanwhile, their third accomplice, Ricardo Hernandez, would manage to avoid capture in the years to come, avoiding justice for the crimes that he and his cohorts had committed. So he was never captured? While investigators were never able to officially clear these three as suspects, they had no reason to believe that any had been involved in the yogurt shop murders. And the thing that really doesn't match, like, how did this woman escape, their victim? Were they planning to murder her and then they simply didn't? Because these Mexican gang members, I mean, if they're these hardened criminals who would commit murder at the drop of a hat, why did they not kill her? And then we do have this other crime of this woman abducted and killed at a nightclub 2 blocks away. I mean, that, again, that's a slightly different MO as well, but I mean, murder is murder here. So, I mean, again, is it possible none of these crimes are related, including the burglaries next door? Because I just have a hard time believing if the same people are burglarizing a place 8 times, I mean, would they burglarize the place next door? I mean, maybe. And then if they were planning never to return to the area, would they also add rape and murder to the list in their crime spree if they knew they weren't going to return again? But why hit that place 8 times? I mean, that almost sounds like some kind of running joke inside of a gang where it's like, oh, let's go hit this place. And then other gang members, we'll go hit that place also. Like 8 times? Like 8 times. That's kind of weird. All right. Anyway, continuing on here. Over the next couple of years, this case would begin to enter cold case territory. Police were seemingly nowhere close to cracking the case, having exhausted all of their workable leads. By all accounts, they were right back where they had started in December of 1991. But the momentum they once had behind them, as well as the public support, was gone. The truth would continue to elude them in the years to come. As the investigation carried on through the rest of 93 and into 94, change was in the air. The public was not satisfied with the overall lack of answers, and the Austin Police Department, facing pressure from elected officials, began to reshuffle the investigation as it struggled to regain its bearing after a couple of high-profile disappointments. Meanwhile, the task force, once assembled to spearhead the case, started to crumble behind the scenes. Sergeant John Jones, who had been overseeing the case from the very beginning, was soon transferred to the APD's Assault Division, a demotion in all but name. He was ceasing the day-to-day responsibility of the yogurt shop case file, but remained a consultant on the case for the foreseeable future. Despite senior officials in APD claiming that Jones had requested the change, Jones himself would dispute that, claiming that he was essentially forced out not only the case but the homicide division entirely. However, Jones himself would later admit that the change might have been for the better, as he had started to develop a serious case of PTSD as a result of working this case full-time for several months, as he had developed close bonds with the victim's family members and other loved ones. He felt a deep sense of grief, not being able to bring them any kind of resolution in the case, as did they, having been unaware of this turnover until they saw it on the news. Sergeant Jones would later describe the administrative turmoil throughout the Austin Police Department as a major deterrent to the investigation which had been plaguing it from the start. Speaking to the Austin American-Statesman, Jones said about himself and his partner, Mike Huckabee, who had single-handedly led the investigation for more than 2 years, quote, "We did the best we could with what we had, and we didn't have much. We could get computer stuff, the community kicked in and did stuff, we got the space in North Austin for a task force office, but we just couldn't get the personnel even though we asked for it. We got stuck in petty politics," end quote. I mean, I don't know, like, obviously personnel would have helped, but it seemed like they followed the leads that they could. I mean, they followed all these leads, like... In truth, this kind of dysfunction would stymie a lot of the early investigation. The APD's homicide division had just 6 detectives at the time of the yogurt shop murders, which was incredibly small for a city of nearly 500,000 people. That is pretty crazy, if they have almost no homicides, but apparently crime was ramping up around that time, so... Yeah, that's weird. Even though Austin's crime rate had been skyrocketing in the years before this crime, okay, so not just the months, but the years, the city hadn't invested heavily in law enforcement division, and it showed in their response to this crime. Again, how much more could they have done, though? Obviously 6 people's not a lot, but, they interviewed everybody that was there. They had, all these false confessions that they followed up with. They did, they had all these suspects. They went to Mexico a bunch of times. I'm not calling them competent in any way. It's just, what more could they have done, even if they had more people? It just seems like either the evidence is just not there, these guys got that lucky, or we're just missing a piece of the puzzle here. And perhaps the police did have the piece of the puzzle, and there's even more unreported information. Again, the police do not always disclose everything they have. So I guess it is possible they have more than that they have not disclosed, but they're just not able to connect those pieces. Meanwhile, the families of the murdered girls would experience some kind of relief that same year, 1994. The year prior, they had filed a lawsuit against the owners of the shopping center that I Can't Believe It's Yogurt was in, as well as the yogurt chain itself. They alleged that the yogurt chain had not done what it could to protect its teenage employees, and that the owners of the shopping center had not responded to the shocking amount of robberies leading up to the murders. That's a good point there. They claimed that this entire ordeal could have been avoided if either or both had dealt with their security issues beforehand. That's a good point. If they hired some security guards, what would that have resulted in? Would this crime still have happened? The suit came to a resolution in January of 1994, and the families were awarded roughly $12 million in a settlement. They would end up using a chunk of the proceeds to set up a nonprofit in the girls' honor called We Will Not Forget, SAJE, which took an initial from each of the girls' first names. Over the next several years, they would end up distributing safety material to businesses and schools throughout Texas, which aimed at preventing a crime like this from ever happening again. By the time this lawsuit came to resolution, all the families had moved out of the area, having been unable to continue living in the same houses that the 4 victims had once called home. Throughout the mid-90s, another prominent suspect would emerge in the form of a serial killer, who for decades had been inspiring terror in Texas. In 1966, Kenneth Allen McDuff had just been paroled for burglary and would go on to commit a heinous crime alongside an accomplice. In that case, McDuff and his accomplice would abduct 2 men and a woman at gunpoint, forcing them into a car trunk and then driving to an isolated location. There, the 2 men were shot in the head. The woman was forcibly raped before being strangled to death by McDuff with a broomstick. The crime would later earn the nickname the Broomstick Murders, but would only remain unsolved for a few hours. The following day, McDuff's accomplice, Roy Dale Green, would confess his involvement to police and agree to testify against him in the subsequent trial. Kenneth McDuff was later arrested, charged, and ultimately sentenced to death for this crime. During his incarceration, however, the death penalty would be suspended, earning McDuff a stay of execution. In 1989, he was granted parole due to an overcrowding issue plaguing Texas prisons, and he became a free man once again. See, this is weird. If the prison is overcrowded, are you going to parole the serial killer? Wouldn't you parole a non-serial killer? Wouldn't that, unless this prison is just full of serial killers and he was the one with the lowest death count, what's going on here? How do these guys get paroled? What about, all the non-violent drug offenders? It's believed that almost immediately after his release, Kenneth McDuff started killing again. He is known to have killed several women throughout Texas over the next couple of years, many of whom went missing or their cases unsolved, while McDuff assimilated back into society. All the while, he became a violent drunk and a cocaine addict, which only exacerbated his existing issues. McDuff lived in the Austin area, and just a couple of years after his release from prison, he would become implicated in the deaths of two women, Melissa Northrup, who he worked with, and Colleen Reed, a woman who that supposedly abducted from a car wash not too far from the yogurt shop, the same month that the yogurt shop murders happened, December 1991. Wait a second. So, is this... So, okay, what? So, two women were abducted and killed within weeks of the yogurt shop murders? By the time police suspected McDuff of either, he had already fled the area, but was later found to be living in the Kansas City region under an assumed name. Following an appearance on the television programs America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries, McDuff was arrested and tried for the murder of Melissa Northrup. He was eventually found guilty and sentenced to death. Subsequently, he was tried for the murder of Austin's Colleen Reed, whose body had not yet been found, but whose disappearance had been linked to McDuff and an accomplice. He was also found guilty in that case and eventually led police to Reed's body just outside of Marlin, Texas. Man, so this guy's still using an accomplice after his first accomplice turned against him in the other murders? I mean, that's kind of weird. For the next few years, Kenneth McDuff would remain on death row, confessing to several crimes that he had already been tied to. In at least a handful of cases, he was able to lead police to the bodies of other women he had killed and disposed of. But as his execution date approached in 1998, McDuff decided to throw up a Hail Mary and confessed to Austin's most infamous unsolved crime, the yogurt shop murders, which remained unsolved nearly 7 years later. He believed that his confession might perhaps grant him more time, at least a stay of execution from the state governor, George W. Bush. But he thought wrong. On November 17, 1998, Kenneth Allen McDuff was executed by the state of Texas. Whatever secrets he might have still had went with him to the grave. Wait, hold on a second. Did they not even try to get in... Whoa. Did they not even try to interview him in relation to that? Did they just assume he was lying? Because what if he can provide details that have never been released proving that he was responsible for the yogurt shop murders? Did they at least not grant him like a 2-minute interview to prove that, to give him a chance to prove that he could have done it? Because if he actually did do it, and they didn't even give him a chance to prove it, like how would they ever... I mean, this is weird. Unless the police never want this solved for whatever reason. This is really weird. After his death, investigators would compare his confession to their records, which included his fingerprints and DNA, which they could compare to samples recovered from the crime scene. Despite Austin police investigating him as a serious suspect, they could find no feasible link between McDuff and the Austin yogurt shop murders, and he was posthumously cleared as a suspect in the case. Like, how did they do that, though? Because he's got a history of using accomplices. Yeah, this is tough. This is really tough. And again, I don't know if I trust the Austin Police Department. I mean, have the FBI investigated McDuff in relation to the yogurt shop murders? Like, have other agencies other than Austin Police investigated him? Because if Austin Police, I don't have that much confidence in whoever the Austin Police Department cleared. I mean, I would need other agencies to clear him to have confidence in that clearing being legitimate. Wow. In January 96, more than 4 years after the yogurt shop murders, APD Detective Paul Johnson was chosen to begin overseeing this investigation, which had not seen much public activity in recent months. Before he could truly dive into the case, however, he needed to reorganize almost everything about it, to try to uncover leads that may have been glossed over or forgotten about in the maelstrom of those first few years. This was no easy task, considering that the investigation led by Sergeant Jones and others had collected information on more than 1,200 suspects, accumulated more than 5,000 pages of handwritten notes in a computer case file containing more than 10,000 pages of reports and logs. See, here's the thing, like, John Jones can say that he was understaffed and all this, but look at the amount of work done! Like, this was not a case swept under the rug where there was no work done. They did a ton of work on this case. I mean, you can't knock them for the quantity. Now, maybe the quality of the work wasn't that great, but the quantity seems to be there, just judging by all this information here. He would have to begin reorganizing everything into smaller, more manageable files, which he tried to separate by tip and by suspect. As you can imagine, this was an incredible lengthy task which would go through several starts and stops over the next couple of years. During this time, the original task force, which was comprised of Austin Police, Travis County Sheriff's officials, members of the FBI and ATF, and others, would officially disband after several months of inactivity. A second task force would be assembled in its aftermath to reconsolidate assets and information, but that too would die a quick death. Perhaps poor phrasing there. It would take a couple of years for this reorganization to truly reap any benefits as the APD began reaching out to outside agencies for help. Wait, only now? What? Not only the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, but the Travis County DA and the Texas State Attorney General. This entire process, which was described by Austin's Assistant Police Chief Michael McDonald as a re-review, was just one of several that would unfold between 96 and 99. In August 99, it was announced that the yogurt shop murder investigation was officially relaunched due to a drop in Austin's homicides in recent years. Members of the APD Homicide Division were being tasked with investigating the area's cold cases in a new task force, the most prominent among them being, of course, the yogurt shop murders. These detectives began going through the reassembled case file with a fine-tooth comb, looking for anything that might have fallen between the cracks months, if not years, beforehand. And surprisingly, after a few weeks, they found something, which harkened back to the early days of the investigation, a supposed confession which had implicated 4 young men in the murders. By early that fall, police officials announced to the press that an arrest was imminent, but many in the region believed that this was an empty threat, similar to the promises Sergeant Jones had made back in January 92. I'm still curious as to who John Jones was talking about in January 92 when he said an arrest was imminent, and then that was never referenced again. Was it these same 4 guys, or were they different suspects? Surprisingly, though, a press conference was quickly thrown together for Wednesday, October 6th, the press conference where Austin police would announce that they had arrested 4 young men and were now charging them with the yogurt shop murders. 2 of the suspects named in this press conference had been connected to the case early on, Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn. If you recall back to the episode introduction, the then 16-year-old Pierce had been arrested at the North Cross Mall 8 days after the murders for unlawfully carrying a .22 cal handgun. During the interview with Austin detectives, Pierce claimed that the pistol had been used in the commission of the yogurt shop murders, and he even implicated his friend, Forrest Wellborn, in the crime. For a variety of reasons, this confession was later discredited by the investigators working the case. Beyond this confession, nothing was linking either of the teens to the yogurt shop. Weeks later, the officer that solicited the confession, Hector Polanco, would later be accused of coercing confessions through intimidation tactics, and this was just believed to be one of those. Both Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn had been cleared by detectives, who believed that Pierce had an undiagnosed mental illness that caused him to give the false confession. Years later, however, during the case's reevaluation, detectives began to dive back into this confession and found it to be incredibly enticing. Now, why is that? Is that because they had nothing else? So, they could only focus on that? And there was pressure to solve the case. They began learning more about the 2 young men that had been questioned at the time, Pierce and Wellborn, as well as the 2 other young men they claimed that they had spent the weekend with, Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen. 3 of the suspects, Wellborn, Scott, and Springsteen, had been attending McCallum High School at the time of the yogurt shop murders. If you recall, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas had attended McCallum before transferring to Lanier High, but it was not believed that she knew any of these 4 young men. All 3 attended McCallum would end up dropping out. Springsteen in December 91, just a couple weeks after the yogurt shop murders. So he continued going to school after the yogurt shop murders. Scott in 92 and Wellborn in 93. So they all continued going to school. That's kind of weird. Maurice Pierce, on the other hand, had attended a handful of Austin area schools, including a few that had treated troubled students, primarily those with behavioral issues and special needs. However, he had actually dropped out before the yogurt shop murders took place, having last attended Anderson High School as a 9th grader. This level of education, or rather the lack of it, fit in with the original police profile that speculated the leader of the group, in this case Maurice Pierce, was an uneducated and volatile youth at the time of the crime. Yeah, but again, if his mental capacity and his mental age is that low, I mean, you can't really trust any kind of confession, especially without any matching details or any other evidence. At the time of the murders, all 4 of these boys had lived in the Austin area and were connected through their friendship to one another. At the time the crimes unfolded, all were teenagers, although their culpability varied because of Texas state law. Maurice Earl Pierce had been 16 at the time of the murders and would continue to live in the Austin area throughout 1997. He had only one significant encounter with police in the years since, a misdemeanor drunk driving arrest from 1992, but had since moved to the Dallas area and begun to live a respectable life. He was working in a warehouse and had just recently married his longtime partner, whom he had known for over a decade and had a 7-year-old child with. Forrest Brooke Welborn had been just 15 at the time of the crime, making him the youngest of the 4 suspects implicated. Like Pierce, Welborn only had one real run-in with the law, a 96 incident in which he had pleaded no contest to driving with a suspended license, but he had since moved to Lockhart, Texas, 30 miles south of Austin. There he lived alone in an RV park and ended up starting a career as a rather talented mechanic. At the time of his arrest, he had just opened up his own shop in Lockhart. Robert Burns Springsteen Jr. was 17 in December 91 and had dropped out of high school less than 2 weeks after the yogurt shop murders. He then moved to West Virginia to be closer to his mother. There he would begin working a series of jobs, including a part-time gig selling newspapers door to door, as well as having once been the manager at a McDonald's fast food restaurant. He had just married his girlfriend that Valentine's Day and was arrested at their home in Charleston, West Virginia. Michael James Scott was a quiet kid with long blonde hair at the time of the murders, an 18-year-old who was enrolled in special ed and generally kept to himself. He would end up repeating his sophomore year before dropping out a year later, roughly 12 months after the yogurt shop murders. He had since found work through a series of mechanical repair jobs and continued to live in the Austin area. Like 2 of the other suspects, he had just recently married his wife that prior March 1998 and regularly helped take care of his wife's child from a prior relationship. See, this is the thing, though. So is it possible that if these guys are rapists and murderers and burglars, is it possible they just are, other than some driving issues, which many people have, of course, on their record, I mean, they just committed 0 violent crimes, or were that genius that they weren't caught for it? I mean, these special ed kids and high school dropouts just are able to continue committing violent crimes and evade the law? I mean, it just doesn't add up. I mean, looking at all their histories and their mental abilities, it does not add up here. I mean, it's weird. After taking these 4 men into custody, police began announcing the type of case that they had against them, one that was built almost entirely upon confessions. Not only the confession from Maurice Pierce back in 91, which he had given when he was just 16, but 2 new confessions, which had come from police interviews with Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott that September. A confession was what had brought police back to these 4 young men all these years later, after they had moved on with their lives. As you just heard, in at least 3 of the 4 instances, the young men had gotten married and started families, and they were now a far cry from the teenage miscreants they had once been. However, when investigators began to look over the case once again, they kept coming back to Maurice Pierce's confession from back in 91. In 96 and 97, police again reached out to those 2 suspects, Pierce and his friend Forrest Welborn, re-interviewing them and seeing if they had any new information to offer. Both had again denied having any involvement in the murders, yet police kept circling back around to that original confession from Pierce, which, even though it had been discredited by investigators, contained points of interest for those now in charge. In 99, well, it's also kind of weird. Wouldn't they have reached out to the original officers? I mean, you'd think they would have. And, ascertained why his confession was discredited. Because, I mean, the original officers who did all the original interviews with all they clearly are closer to the case than these new officers who are just starting to investigate. In 99, when the investigation into the yogurt shop murders was officially relaunched, detectives began reaching out not only to Pierce and Welborn, but to the 2 young men they had been with that weekend, Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen. In Pierce's original confession, he had claimed that the 4 had stolen a golden Nissan Pathfinder that Saturday, a day after the murders, and then driven to San Antonio. Now, investigators were hoping to verify that info and potentially implicate 2 others in the crime. Now, instead of just interviewing Pierce and Welborn, they began interviewing all 4, with the young men having gone off in separate directions in recent years and no longer really communicating with one another. They could possibly catch one of them off guard and then use that info to springboard into another confession. I mean, that's not a bad plan, but I mean, without any actual evidence, I mean, and again, with these personalities don't seem to match. This is exactly what ended up happening. During an interview with police, September 9th, 1999, Michael Scott began telling police what they wanted to hear. This came after roughly 18 hours of interviews over 4 days, but at the end of it, Scott, a high school dropout that had been enrolled in special ed, started to tell police what they wanted to hear. Again, this is reminiscent of the Brendan Dassey so-called confession. I mean, this special ed dropout, I mean, they're just badgering him for countless hours. Like, this is weird. As you heard, Michael Scott provided police with a lot of info, which was limited to not only a specific series of events, but information that police had supposedly withheld from the crime scene, such as the materials used to bind the victims, as well as their location within the yogurt shop. Now that they had this information, investigators proceeded to question the next of the four, Robert Springsteen, who was living in West Virginia at the time. Just like Scott, Springsteen would confess, verifying that their group of four had conspired to rob the yogurt shop, then raped and murdered the teenage girls inside. Based on these two confessions, police had created the following timeline, which they believed to be airtight. Shortly before closing time, one of the boys had gone inside the yogurt shop to scope it out and unlock the back door. Forrest Wellborn, the youngest of the four, had remained outside in the car and acted as a lookout. There, he watched for any sign of trouble as the other three went into the yogurt shop at around closing time through the unlocked back door to begin the robbery. While inside, the three culprits had proceeded to sexually assault at least two of the victims, forcing them to undress and then binding them with their own clothing before executing all four, setting the crime scene on fire, and then fleeing before help could arrive. And you know what's interesting? This might be what happened, just not with these four guys. Because again, the DNA doesn't match. But in terms of what actually happened, I mean, maybe that is how it transpired, just with other people. During the press conference announcing the filing of charges against these four young men, police and other public officials began taking their victory lap, praising the arrest as the largest step in a long and painful grieving process. During the press conference, Austin Mayor Kirk Watson even stated, quote, "On December 6, 1991, we as a city lost our innocence. Today we regain our confidence," end quote. The loved ones of the victims expressed gratitude toward the investigators for dedicating so much time to the case over the years, but were too reluctant to begin gloating quite yet. It had still taken police nearly 8 years to arrive at this point, and had done so only after circling back to some early leads that the original investigators had discounted entirely. Doubts would continue to linger in many minds, including the victims' families. After all, the four young men that now stood accused had themselves been teenagers at the time of the murders, and their age was surely going to be a hassle as the inevitable trial moved forward. I mean, how many people really buy that these special ed kids could have pulled this off without well, I mean, DNA was left, and it doesn't match them, so it's kind of, you know, I don't know. Would special ed kids know about styrofoam accelerants and stuff? I mean, I don't know. It had still taken police nearly 8 years to arrive at this point, and had done so after only circling back to some early leads that the original investigators had discounted entirely. Doubts would continue to linger in many minds, including the victims' families. After all, the four, especially since prosecutors stated that they were going to be pushing for the death penalty in at least 2 out of the 4 cases. The other 2, since they had been minors at the time, could only be sentenced to life in prison. While police and prosecutors were assured that they had the culprits of Austin's most high-profile murder case behind bars, awaiting trial, a more complicated story would begin to unfold over the next several months, a story that wasn't as black and white as officials would lead the public to believe. This was a much more nuanced story, which didn't just exchange 4 bad boys for the 4 good girls lost nearly a decade prior. Even though police had rolled out these 4 suspects on a figurative silver platter, their guilt was far from assured. In October 88, roughly 3 years before Austin's infamous yogurt shop murders, a similar story began to play out in another establishment in the city. On the morning of October 24th, 1988, 20-year-old Nancy DePriest was opening up an Austin area Pizza Hut all by herself, which wasn't unusual. However, that morning, someone would gain entry to the Pizza Hut and would brutally attack Nancy inside. Her lifeless body was later found naked, bound, and bleeding from a gunshot wound to the head. A panicked investigation ensued, with police unable to find out who had committed this heinous crime. However, roughly 2 weeks afterwards, suspicion was cast upon 2 young men that lived in the area who happened to work at another Pizza Hut nearby. 22-year-old Christopher Ochoa and 18-year-old Richard Danziger, who also happened to be roommates, drove to the parking lot of the Pizza Hut that Nancy DePriest had been killed at, and were spotted by employees drinking beers inside of their car. When pressed about what they were doing at the location, both men would later claim that they were having a beer in Nancy's honor, despite not knowing her in life. The store employees, who were on edge following the murder, understandably, ended up calling the police and informing them of the young men's unusual behavior. For that reason, detectives began narrowing in on these two for the murder of Nancy DePriest, quickly naming them suspects and bringing them in for police interviews. At first, Ochoa and Danziger denied having any involvement in the crime, but then, after being separated for standalone interviews headed by APD Detective Hector Polanco, one of the two, Christopher Ochoa, confessed. In a recorded interview, he claimed that Danziger and he had raped and murdered Nancy DePriest and would later agree to a plea deal, which saw him pleading guilty to murder and agree to testify against his alleged co-conspirator. In Richard Danziger's subsequent trial, it became clear that the state had no physical evidence implicating either man in that crime, even though forensic evidence had been recovered from the crime scene, including semen and hair follicles from the offender. Throughout his trial, Danziger would continue to deny involvement, but the state relied heavily upon the confession of his roommate and co-worker, Christopher Ochoa, even though his recorded series of events had changed several times, at times implicating both Danziger and himself, and at other times implicating neither, but included information the detectives state was impossible to fabricate. These were intimate details of the crime scene which were known only to police and the culprit. Eventually, Danziger was found guilty of sexual assault, and alongside Ochoa, he was sentenced to life in prison. Years later, a man named Achim Joseph Marino began writing letters to police in Austin. Marino was a born-again Christian serving 3 life sentences for a litany of crimes, including aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon and sexual assault, which he was convicted of in 1990. In order to come clear to his God, Marino began writing letters to not only the police, but Austin area newspapers as well as the ACLU, letters in which he confessed to the rape and murder of Nancy DePriest. When these letters were ignored, Marino began turning his attention to the Texas governor at the time, George W. Bush. These letters finally led to some kind of response by authorities, and police in Austin were forced to address the matter, even though the Nancy DePriest case file had been closed for almost a decade. Marino offered up evidence that police had never been able to find in the original investigation, such as the murder weapon, as well as the keys that the culprit had used to gain entry into the building. And that tells you a lot about the police, who they refused to even talk to this guy originally. So, they do not want to be shown how dumb they are in trusting these false confessions or instigating them. When the APD finally re-examined their case from years prior, they found abhorrent behavior from the detectives that had handled it. Namely, the investigators had interrogated the young and impressionable Christopher Ochoa alone for several hours. Among them was Detective Hector Polanco, who had told Ochoa that he would be executed by the state if he did not confess. So regarding the yogurt shop murders, if you're telling a special ed high school dropout that he's going to be executed if he doesn't confess, what would they do? Polanco also seemed to allude to Ochoa becoming fresh meat for other inmates in prison, hinting at him becoming a victim of prison rape if he did not cooperate with the investigation. Man, this Polanco guy needs to be thrown in Gen Pop. During Ochoa's 2 interviews with police, he had been asked incredibly leading questions by Polanco and other detectives, which ultimately fed information the police claimed only the culprit would know. Over the years, Ochoa had stuck by his original confession only because he feared police were trying to frame him for other crimes that he hadn't committed. DNA testing would later prove once and for all that Achim Joseph Marino had committed the crime. His confession, which was backed by physical evidence, created an airtight case that was beyond reproach. Christopher Ochoa was released from prison on January 16, 2001, after spending more than a decade behind bars for a crime that he had coerced into confessing to. His one-time roommate, Richard Danziger, was released from custody a little over 2 months later on, March 22nd, due to some precautionary measures. You see, shortly into his incarceration, Richard Danziger had been physically assaulted by other inmates, which resulted in him receiving permanent brain damage that would require him to receive lifelong care. See, Polanco should be on the hook for all of this. At the time of his release, he was actually no longer being held inside of prison, but was being housed in a state-run mental institution. Both men were officially exonerated in 2002 and would later file lawsuits against Austin and Travis County. Ochoa would receive $5.3 million from Austin taxpayers, while Danziger would receive close to $11 million, which came from not only Austin and Travis County residents, but compensation for injuries he had sustained while incarcerated, as well as a sizable chunk from Ochoa for falsely implicating him. This story would unfold at the same time another story was captivating Austin. the story of the infamous yogurt shop murders, which would keep the city ensnared for over a decade. In that case, 4 girls had been murdered back in December 91, and their crime would go completely unsolved until October 99, when police announced the arrest of 4 suspects who had come upon their radar after a similar confession, which coincidentally was also conducted by Hector Polanco. At the time of these arrests in 99, Polanco had ascended from detective to lieutenant, but the city would begin to try and distance themselves from the officer who at this point was seen as a decorated veteran of the department, but also a lightning rod for controversy. In addition to coercing this false confession from Christopher Ochoa back in 1988, he had solicited a now discredited confession from Maurice Pierce back in 91. A confession that ultimately ensnared Pierce and 3 of his teenage friends in the high-profile yogurt shop investigation. The specifics of that confession would continue to haunt investigators years later, as would the confessions the police had since solicited from the 2 of the suspects in the years since. The investigation into the yogurt shop murders had been officially relaunched in August 99, and for the next month, police would begin to re-interview suspects from months and years prior. This included those that had never really panned out or been thoroughly explored in the past, among whom were Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn, 2 young men that had been implicated in the case back in 91. It also included Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen, 2 of their friends whom they had claimed to be with on the weekend of the yogurt shop murders. Austin detectives arranged interviews with Scott and Springsteen that September, and in repeated interviews held over several days, both would eventually confess to their involvement. First came Michael Scott in a police interview September 9th, and then Springsteen just a few days later, who was living in West Virginia at the time. This would ultimately lead to the arrest of all 4 on October 6th, with police having announced their imminent detainment days prior. Even though all 4 would be charged in the infamous yogurt shop crime, authorities would begin to run into their first of several issues. Robert Springsteen, one of the 2 young men that had confessed, was living in West Virginia and, through his lawyers, would deny Texas state the right to extradite him for trial. This would force authorities to go through the legal and lengthy process of requesting extradition through state governments. He would finally be transferred to Texas custody the following month, November 1999. Additionally, authorities would have to certify 2 of the other suspects as adults. Since Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn had been minors at the time of the yogurt shop murders, but could no longer be tried in juvenile court, the state needed to certify that they could stand trial as adults. This was the only way to successfully try them on capital murder charges. But, just like the extradition of Springsteen, would take time to unfold in the court system. Because of their age at the time of the crime, the 2 would also manage to avoid the death penalty should they be found guilty. Despite police having these 2 new confessions from Scott and Springsteen, prosecutors knew that they would likely need much more than that to successfully convict all 4 of the suspects. Especially since Maurice Pierce's original confession from 91 would be inadmissible in court due to investigators having thrown it out years ago, as well as the detective at the time, Hector Polanco, developing a reputation for soliciting false confessions. Prosecutors also knew that Texas state law made it virtually impossible for co-conspirators' confession to be the only evidence linking someone to a crime, since they themselves were admitting to the crime and their judgment could not be wholly trusted over a co-conspirators. Because Scott and Springsteen had confessed to the crime, their confessions could be used against them and each other, but not against the other 2 who had denied involvement. Prosecutors would need additional evidence to go after Pierce and Wellborn, physical evidence, forensics, witness sightings, just something substantial since detectives had investigated and cleared them years prior. Police still had Maurice Pierce's gun from 91 in custody, the .22 cal that he had been carrying when he was arrested by the police at North Cross Mall 8 days after the murders. They had been unable to link that gun to the murders back then, but they were now hoping to do so with more advanced testing methods. These ballistic tests could play out in the background of the case over the next several months as more information about the suspects and their arrests began to leak out to the press. The news that 4 young men had been arrested for the area's most high-profile unsolved case shocked not only the community, but the victims' families, who had been clamoring for justice for the better part of a decade. The parents of the 4 victims would hold a press conference that week, and despite them being happy that answers could have been found, they advised everyone around them to express caution. They wanted the trial to work its way through the court system the right way, since it was unlikely that they would get an opportunity like this again. I mean, unless they actually found the real guys with matching DNA evidence. Meanwhile, those that knew or had known the 4 suspects could not believe that they had been charged in this crime. Their loved ones believed that the 4 could never have committed a crime like this in their past, even though they had been known delinquents in their teenage years. The 4 young men had a handful of petty crimes between them, but had never expressed any known violent behaviors, at least nothing out of the ordinary. Each young man had some kind of relatively minor run-ins with the law, which included a misdemeanor weed arrest for Michael Scott, driving with a suspended license for Forrest Wellborn, and a DUI for Robert Springsteen. Among the four, Maurice Pierce was the only one with an established criminal record, but most of that came from his youth and could be tied to his volatile home environment. He had been forced to drop out of high school to help take care of and provide for his family, and before that he had been known to occasionally use illicit drugs and get into fights at school. But besides his history of petty crimes, as well as his 91 arrest for unlawfully carrying a handgun, he didn't have a violent record and hadn't committed a crime in several years at the time of his arrest in 1999. Yet he was tagged as the leader of this vicious crime due to him seeming to fit the prerequisites of the profile that police had released to the public years earlier. But I mean, if this guy is that mentally challenged, though, I mean, does he really have the mental capacity to carry this out? The families of the two men that had confessed, Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen, pointed to their level of education as a major reason for them to falsely confess. Both had been enrolled in special ed and had to repeat grades before dropping out of high school. So not only were they in special ed classes, but they couldn't even pass the special ed classes. They had to repeat grades in special ed. Their loved ones cited this lack of education as well as their impressionable natures as proof that police had solicited these confessions through intimidation tactics that they knew the two would be susceptible to. Not to mention the police, Polanco having a history of threatening and getting false confession. But those cries would fall on deaf ears for the next several months as their trials continued to barrel forward with inevitable momentum. Throughout November 99, certification hearings were held to conclude whether or not Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn, the youngest of the four suspects, could be tried as adults in upcoming trial. These hearings would be the first time that much of the info about the case and the investigation would be purveyed to the world at large. These hearings included details about how the teenage girls had died, the state of undress that their bodies had been found in, the specifics of how their bodies had been burned, and the implication that at least two of the four victims had been sexually assaulted before their deaths. As you can imagine, this made an incredibly emotional affair for the victims' loved ones who had been living in the unknown for almost 8 years. For the first time, a series of events for the crime was laid out to the general public, which the police claimed to have been put together via confessions from Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen. According to them, one of the boys had scoped out the yogurt shop during its open hours and had unlocked the back door. Along with the two others, they had snuck back in around closing time, while the youngest suspect, Forrest Wellborn, remained outside as a lookout. Inside the yogurt shop, and again, so hold on a second. So none of the people, there were no witnesses who placed them there? Because this guy's outside of the shop, the others are inside. I mean, nobody saw them? I mean, that's kind of weird. Also, you know what kind of sucks? These overzealous and corrupt police with these coerced confessions, when they're bringing all these details that were previously not known, now they're known. So now they can get more false confessions. I mean, you'd think they'd hold something back just in case, but, and of course, if a DNA matches, it matches, but yeah, they let all these details out thinking that they're going to get these four guys, but if they're not these four guys, they just let all these details out publicly now that can't be trusted for confessions. Did they do that on purpose? Inside the yogurt shop, they had planned on robbing the place at the orders of their leader, Maurice Pierce. But he had allegedly freaked out over a small amount of money being found in the register, which seemed to stand in contrast to the facts, as auditors had found upwards of $500 missing from the store that night. I mean, that's a decent chunk of change from 1991. According to the case laid out by the state, Scott and Springsteen had begun to rape and murder the four victims at the behest of Pierce. They bolstered their case with testimony from investigators that had worked the case in the past, as well as first responders that had been at the crime scene the night of the murders. Together, they painted a terrifying portrait of the four offenders, which was enough to convince Judge Jeannie Moorer to certify Pierce and Wellborn, allowing them to be tried as adults in their upcoming trials. However, because the state was unable to provide any physical evidence throughout the certification hearings, the bail for both Pierce and Wellborn was lowered significantly, allowing the latter, Wellborn, to post bond that December. Indictments would follow later that month, with Robert Springsteen being indicted for the murder of Amy Ayers on December 14th. Michael Scott and Maurice Pierce would be indicted on the same charge on December 28th. That's kind of curious, because that's the only thing they're being charged with, the murder of Amy Ayers, and not the other three. Absent from these indictments entirely was the fourth suspect, Forrest Wellborn, who had been the youngest of the four. According to the confessions given by Scott and Springsteen, Wellborn had been nothing more than a lookout outside of the store, who, after a few minutes of waiting, had supposedly walked away from the crime scene. According to the confessions, Welborn had been unaware of the violence taking place inside and was later found walking down the road from the yogurt shop when they found him. What? So he abandoned being a lookout? Even these two confessions, police had absolutely nothing linking Forrest Welborn to the murders, so he was the only one of the four to remain unindicted by the end of the year. After posting bond, he would continue to live life as a free man as he awaited the official filing of charges. According to Welborn's lawyers, prosecutors were eager to get him to testify even though he had denied wrongdoing ever since '91, when he was originally tied to the crime through a false confession by his friend, Maurice Pierce. They would later state that throughout December, prosecutors would approach Welborn and offer him total immunity if he agreed to testify against the other three, which pointed to the state having very little actual evidence, if any. Speaking to the publication Texas Monthly in 2001, criminal attorney Gary Cohen stated, quote, "That's not a card the state plays unless it's in serious trouble. For the state to let him walk signals that they have some serious problems with proof. That man firmly believes he is not culpable in any way," end quote. While the three incarcerated suspects continued to await trial, events throughout 2000 would begin to point to a troubled prosecution, which was marred by significant setbacks to the police investigation. On May 2nd of that year, a ballistics report from the ATF indicated that the .22 caliber handgun, originally seized from Maurice Pierce after his '91 arrest, was not the murder weapon of the four girls in the yogurt shop. The gun that Pierce was carrying left very distinct impressions on the rounds it dispersed, which were not present on any of the four .22 cal bullets that had been retrieved from the victims' bodies. Okay, interesting. So this is the latest testing revealed that this handgun was not. So in the past, when they already discounted him, they discounted him when it could not be determined if his gun was the murder weapon. So maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but they discounted his confession. Now it's clear from the ATF that it's not. It's definitely not the murder weapon. So now they don't even have a maybe. Investigators had also been unable to locate the .38 caliber handgun which was used in the crime, having been used to shoot and kill 13-year-old Amy Ayers, and photos of police dredging local bodies of water in a desperate effort to find the weapon would solicit laughter from skeptics who thought it funny that police were quite literally fishing for answers. I mean, it's better than doing nothing, though. The May 2nd report from the ATF, paired with the inability to locate either of the firearms used in the crime, seemed to poke holes in the state's case. Additionally, skeptics were concerned that the police had been unable or unwilling to perform ballistic tests in the interim 8+ years since they had been sitting on Pierce's .22 cal handgun for that entire time. Wait a second, so they never attempted to do any tests? Okay, that's kind of weird. Whoa, okay. Well, in June 2000, it would come to light that Austin police had known about the ballistics discrepancy as far back as January 1999, months before they decided to file charges against the four suspects. Okay, what does everybody make of this? I mean, not only is this corruption, but I mean, what kind of ineptitude is this? So they know the gun doesn't match, and they want, I mean, what are they doing? Like, this is weird. So they had known back then that the .22 cal was not the murder weapon, but had decided not to include that information in prior filings, including the November hearings to certify Pierce and Welborn as adults, as they thought it might work against them. Yeah. Detective Paul Johnson, who had been spearheading the investigation, claimed that he had simply forgotten to include this information in his reports. Wow. But that claim would turn out to be as convenient for him as it was ridiculous. He had testified throughout 1999 that the bullets retrieved from the crime scene were too damaged to compare to the revolver retrieved from Maurice Pierce 8 days later, which was quite simply a false statement. Wow, so it's not just Palanca, it's this Paul Johnson scumbag also, who are just clearly lying just to get anybody for this crime. I mean, this is such a perversion of justice. I mean, the victims deserve to have real justice and get the guys who are actually guilty. I mean, this is so messed up. That month, a photo would begin to make the rounds online, which was a photocopied image that had been presented at a pretrial hearing for the three suspects. The image showed Detective Robert Merrill, one of the officers working the revamped yogurt shop investigation, holding a gun to the back of suspect Michael Scott's head. Merrill later claimed that this was a common tactic that he used to jog suspects' memories. Wow, that's not helping his case. So he admitted to doing this to a lot of people. But this raised a lot of alarms, especially since the APD already had a reputation for soliciting false confessions. And it was an image of police quite literally obtaining a confession at the end of a gun. Okay, just when you think this can't get any worse. So it's not just the Polanco scumbag. It's not just the Paul Johnson scumbag, but this Robert Merrill scumbag is literally holding a gun to potentially innocent individuals' heads to get them to confess. Wow, does anybody have any respect left for the Austin Police Department at this point? The validity of this image, which was taken straight from Scott's recorded confession, would severely damage the state's case, as it had been built, if not entirely, then mostly, upon Scott's confession. If defense attorneys could begin to cloud the issue of how the confession was obtained, they could almost single-handedly sink the prosecution's case. Especially when you factored in details about Scott himself. He was a high school dropout who had been enrolled in special ed, and was known by all to be somewhat simple and very impressionable. His loved ones believed that he could easily be influenced by psychological threats, especially if they included threats of violence. As if June of 2000 hadn't been bad enough for the state's case, the prosecution decided later that month to officially drop charges against Forrest Wellborn, the youngest of the four suspects. A second grand jury had failed to indict him for any of the crimes he had been accused of, which meant that charges officially had to be dropped against him. Even though the APD stated that Wellborn was still under investigation, the dropping of charges highlighted the lack of evidence that they had in this case. At this point, they had started to test DNA found at the crime scene, and none of it proved to be a match to the four suspects. In fact, other than the two confessions the police had obtained in September of 1999, there was close to nothing linking any of the four suspects to the yogurt shop or any of the victims. Forrest Wellborn had originally been freed back in December 1999 after posting a cash bond, which would now be returned to him. Prosecutors had failed to indict him back then, and this second failure in June 2000 seemed to completely tank their case against him. But the personal damage to Wellborn had already been done. His auto body shop in Lockhart, Texas, which he had opened just months before his arrest, had shut down without him there to operate it, and because of the public crusade being waged against him, he was virtually unemployable throughout Texas. With the dropping of charges, he could begin to return to somewhat normality, but his loved ones and he knew that this story was far from over. Wellborn has refused to speak to the media or address the case publicly in the years since, but he would continue to feel the effects of his arrest decades later. The case against Robert Springsteen would be the first to be tried, with his trial beginning in April 2001 after months of delays. Springsteen, who had recanted his confession by this point, pled not guilty. The prosecution had decided to only charge him in one of the four murders, that of the youngest victim, 13-year-old Amy Ayers, choosing to withhold the other three murders in case of an acquittal. Okay, so that's why they did that. First came jury selection, in which only one out of the potential 200 jurors had never heard of the yogurt shop murders. Then came evidence selection, in which the prosecution and the defense argued over whether or not Michael Scott's confession would be admissible in this trial. After all, Scott himself had not yet been tried, and video footage of his confession showed police holding a gun to his head at one point. Ultimately, it would be decided that Scott's confession would be allowed in Robert Springsteen's trial, even though the defense wasn't allowed to cross-examine Scott. This would end up coming up later, so keep that in mind moving forward. The defense received a second blow when they were told they were not able to present details about investigative blunders or alternative suspects, such as serial killer Kenneth McDuff, who had confessed to the crime before his 1998 execution. This is so weird. This is like corruption on the scale of the Stephen Avery, Brendan Dassey case as well. They're not allowed to say, wait a second, it could be somebody else. Nope, not allowed. It has to be you, even though you're innocent. The prosecution, who had no physical evidence to present, ended up relying mostly upon the two confessions from Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen, as well as additional witness statements from people that they knew at the time who testified to the men being in the neighborhood of the yogurt shop on the night of the murders. So not necessarily around the shop itself, just in the neighborhood within X amount of blocks. Huh, okay. Even though the state's case seemed to have several holes, which were pointed out by the defense, it was enough for the jury to convict Robert Springsteen for the murder of Amy Ayers. In June 2001, he was sentenced to death after 2 days of deliberation, a verdict that was sure to send reverberation to the other two suspects awaiting trial, Michael Scott and Maurice Pierce. Of them, Scott was the next to stand trial, but that wouldn't begin until the next year, 2002. And what's with all these delays? The trial to decide Michael Scott's innocence or guilt began in July 2002 and almost immediately proceeded just like the first. The state's case was centered almost entirely upon Scott's confession, which he recanted by this point, and his lawyers claimed had been coerced by law enforcement. That claim was bolstered throughout the trial by images of Detective Merrill holding a gun to Scott's head during his interrogation. As it had been during the trial of Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott's trial was remarkable in only that he was charged with a single murder, that of Amy Ayers. Police continued to hedge their bets in case Scott was acquitted, that they could immediately charge him with the other three deaths. Despite that, they presented no physical evidence or direct witness sightings, instead relying mostly on Scott's original confession, which had been bolstered by a subsequent confession by the now convicted Springsteen. Scott's trial would carry on for several weeks, with closing statements not made until the end of September. On September 22, 2002, Michael Scott was found guilty of murder, and just a couple days later he was sentenced to life in prison, with the jury not believing him to be a threat to society should he be paroled in the distant future. That's weird. They think he's guilty, but he's not a threat to society? None of this makes any sense. Now, with two of the four original suspects convicted, the trial against the third and only remaining suspect, Maurice Pierce, was set to begin. Pierce, who had been maligned as the leader of this group and the orchestrator of this entire crime, had become public enemy number one for the Austin area, and his trial was set to become a make-or-break moment for the entire case. Even though Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen had now been convicted, the prosecution had centered around their entire case around the basis that Maurice Pierce was the main culprit, the action man, as described by Scott and Springsteen in their confessions. Following the conviction of Michael Scott in fall of 2002, District Judge Mike Lynch set a date for Pierce's trial to begin April 21st, 2003. Even though prosecutors had been successful in both cases to date, they were now faced with a pretty dire situation. Under Texas state law, individuals cannot be convicted of a crime when the only evidence against them is a co-conspirator's confession. That was the exact situation that Maurice Pierce found himself in after sitting in police custody since October 1999. Prosecutors had no evidence linking Pierce to the crime other than Scott and Springsteen's confessions, which had resulted in two of them being convicted. But other than that, they had no physical evidence, no witness sightings that put Pierce in the vicinity of the yogurt shop, no direct links to the victims, no matching ballistic tests, nothing. Under Texas law, they could not feasibly move forward with a trial since Pierce himself had not confessed to any wrongdoing. Besides, both Scott and Springsteen had recanted their confessions in the preceding years, and even if they were called to the stand to testify against Pierce, they would refuse to do so. So in January 2003, less than 3 months after sentencing Michael Scott to life in prison, Maurice Pierce, the alleged ringleader of this murder plot, was released from police custody. Subsequently, all charges against him were dropped, even though investigators still publicly considered him a suspect. Authorities pledged to continue investigating Pierce for those murders, but had to admit that in the 11-plus years since the yogurt shop murders, they had been unable to uncover any evidence whatsoever connecting Pierce to the crime. So this is kind of weird. They're not calling him a person of interest. They're calling him a suspect with no evidence while admitting they have no evidence to link him to the crime. So how is this not libel and slander at this point? Days after his release, Maurice Pierce would hold a press conference in which he was flanked by his wife, his 10-year-old daughter, and his attorney. He refused to answer any question about the past few years, choosing not to address the investigation or the failed case against him, but professed his innocence and announced that he was excited to begin his life as a free man once again. However, he admitted during the press conference that he was a changed man and that, quote, "my life will never be the same," end quote. Neither Maurice Pierce nor the other released suspect, Forrest Welborn, would ever be charged again in the future, with police never having enough evidence to move forward against either. In the years to come, both Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott would appeal their convictions, citing a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court in the Crawford v. Washington case. In that landmark ruling from 2004, it had been ruled that every individual deserved the right to cross-examine witnesses used against them. Citing the Sixth Amendment, the right to face your accuser, it was believed that this could ultimately earn both of the men freedom, as they had been unable to cross-examine each other in their trials. Meanwhile, another decision from the Supreme Court would ultimately commute death penalties for anyone convicted of a crime they committed as a minor, which included Robert Springsteen, who had been under 18 years of age at the time the murders happened. Even without even having to file an appeal, the death penalty had been commuted to life in prison. In 2006, Robert Springsteen's appeal would get heard by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, who began reviewing the case with the recent Supreme Court decision in mind. This meant that they began to re-evaluate all of the available evidence, which, if you'll recall, was mostly limited to the two men's confessions. That May, the court could just barely decide to overturn Springsteen's conviction by a 5-4 ruling, stating that Springsteen had been given an unfair trial because he had been deprived of his right to cross-examine Michael Scott. This would immediately vacate his conviction and put his case on shaky ground moving forward, should the prosecution move forward with a retrial. The state would later appeal this decision, taking their appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, hoping to get Springsteen's conviction reinstated. However, in 2006, the Supreme Court refused to hear their appeal, citing their decision for everyone to have the right to face their accuser as defined by the Bill of Rights. Michael Scott would later have his own conviction overturned, citing the exact same parameters. Now, after successfully convicting half of the four named suspects, prosecutors were in a significantly worse spot than they had been in years prior, with only 2 suspects behind bars awaiting trial. Over the next few years, retrials would be ordered for both Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen, but the prosecution would begin to realize that their winning cases against both had to be totally re-examined, because they had relied so heavily upon the two men's confessions, both of which were now unreliable at best. They had to come up with a smoking gun of some sort. In 2008, at the urging of the defense, the prosecution decided to call for more advanced DNA testing to take place, which would re-examine samples taken from the victims' bodies as well as from their clothing that had been wearing on the night of the murders, which had been used to bind and gag them. It was believed that if officials were unable to match the samples of the four named suspects to any of the DNA samples, then it would almost assuredly convince a jury that the 2 remaining suspects had never been at the crime scene. Prosecutors pushed back against this, claiming that the items had been tainted by investigators and other handlers over the years. But Judge Mike Lynch agreed to let the testing move forward to determine the men's guilt once and for all. I mean, that's a real scumbag move, because first of all, I mean, maybe it's tainted, maybe it wasn't, right? I mean, this isn't like the 70s or the 60s or even the 80s. I mean, they had some kind of evidence handling procedures. I mean, this is the city of Austin. It's not some backwoods little town or village where they don't have any kind of technology. I mean, you would think they'd have some kind of proper protocols to handle the evidence. But they were pushing back against testing the DNA samples with newer technology to find out who the actual culprits were. I mean, that's just scummy. I mean, all these prosecutors should be put in prison for this. Like, this is crazy. Because it's almost like, it's like they know they're innocent, and they just want to cover it all up, kind of like in the Avery Dassey case. I'm almost kind of surprised that this Mike Lynch judge agreed to the testing. Later that year, 2008, it was reported that the DNA of an unidentified male had been found on a vaginal swab of one of the victims, Amy Ayers, almost assuring that she had been raped before her death and pointing to at least one offender through DNA. Surprisingly, but why was it surprisingly? The DNA was not a match for either Michael Scott or Robert Springsteen or Maurice Pierce or Forrest Wellborn, which, if not exonerating them, certainly seemed to point the finger towards another unknown male. The completion of more advanced DNA testing would carry on through 2008, but seemed to point to good things for the defendants, who at this point had been behind bars for almost an entire decade. I mean, that just sucks because of these scummy criminal cops coercing confessions like these guys. I mean, this is just messed up. It's not like these were definitively convicted murderers of other crimes where you could say, oh, well, they're murderers anyway. I mean, these are guys with basically no violent offenses. These are special ed dropout kids. DNA samples were taken from the bodies of all 4 victims and seemed to point to an unknown number of individuals that had perpetrated this crime, whose DNA was not a match of any of the named suspects. And also, they should test the DNA against the handlers, like the police officers and the handlers of the evidence, just to know, okay, well, maybe this was part of the handlers, because if it's not the handlers, then it seems to point to the actual perpetrators of the crime. In fact, after reevaluation, DNA samples were taken from the bodies of all 4 victims and seemed to point to an unknown number of individuals that had perpetrated this crime, whose DNA did not match any of the named suspects. In fact, after a reevaluation of all of the DNA found at the crime scene, none of it matched with Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, Maurice Pierce, or Forrest Wellborn. Their DNA was not present at the crime scene or on the bodies in any way whatsoever. So basically these special ed dropouts, is it possible that they're smart enough to not leave their DNA, and yet they committed the crime with at least 2 or 3 other people who weren't smart enough? So were the non-special ed kids were the ones that left the DNA, and the special ed dropouts were the ones who somehow magically did not leave their DNA. Is that what the state is alleging? I mean, this is just insanity. Their DNA was not present at the crime scene or on the bodies in any way whatsoever. Unfortunately, because these were such small samples, which were only obtained through cutting-edge forensic testing, they could not be submitted to state or federal databases such as CODIS, but they could be compared to specific suspects. And in the case of these 4 men, none of the samples would ever prove to be a match. Not a single one. Well, could they? Okay. So couldn't they just manually go through CODIS? I mean, obviously this would be a huge task because of all the samples, but I mean, come on, just start with, Texas known criminals who operated in Texas. It would take a really long time, but couldn't they manually just go through and test? Citing the prosecution's concern that they may have been contaminated by handlers or technicians over the years, these samples were also compared to the officials that had handled evidence over the years. Likewise, it was not a match for any of them. Yeah, so there goes that excuse by the corrupt prosecution. Whoever those DNA samples belonged to, they were almost undoubtedly the culprits of the infamous yogurt shop murders, who remain unidentified to this day. Man, see, the prosecution's so scummy because, yeah, that's clearly the way to do it. You just test the DNA against all the people that handled the evidence. So if it doesn't match them, and it doesn't match these special ed dropouts, then who do they match? Most likely the actual perpetrators of the crime. So this leads us to summer 2009, when the retrials of both Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were set to begin. Rosemary Lemberg, who had just become the DA for Travis County earlier that year, was now responsible for leading the case against both men. She had administered over the several months' worth of DNA testing that had unfolded throughout the first half of that year, which seemed to rule out the 2 remaining suspects entirely. Heading into that June, Lumberg had a tough decision on her hands. Either keep pressing forward on the current path and have her prosecutors prepare a case against the 2 men with a more neutered version of what prosecutors had presented years earlier, which did nothing to address the new DNA evidence, or admit that the state didn't have enough evidence to press charges and risk letting the 2 men go free. That June, Rosemary Lemberg would hold a press conference where she announced that she and the rest of her office were not prepared to move forward with the case as it stood. This takes us to Wednesday, June 24th, 2009, the day in which Judge Mike Lynch would order both Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen to be released from jail. So they knew the DNA wasn't a match for what, 2+ years? And they still kept them in prison? This is just messed up. That afternoon, both men would be released from custody for the first time in almost a decade, even though they would remain under indictment for the foreseeable future, meaning that they had to remain in the area, avoid contact with anyone related to the case, etc. They were free for the first time in 1999. That's kind of weird. They're letting them go because the DNA doesn't match. They were not there, allegedly, and yet they're still being treated as criminals. Crazy. Just a few months later, October 2009, the charges against Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen would be dismissed by the Travis County DA, officially ending this chapter of their lives, and unofficially exonerating them of the crimes that had consumed an entire decade of their lives. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott would finally be released from jail in 2009, but the other 2 named suspects, Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn, had been released from police custody years earlier. While Forrest Wellborn had managed to avoid any legal trouble throughout that time, Maurice Pierce had struggled to readapt to life outside, and that culminated in an incident in December 2010. Just before Christmas 2010, Maurice Pierce was fatally shot by a police officer after running from his car following a routine traffic stop. Pierce had been observed by officers failing to stop at a stop sign, and was then pulled over in a residential neighborhood. As soon as he pulled over to the side of the road, Pierce began running through the neighborhood and was chased on foot by both officers, who eventually caught up to him a few blocks over. In the altercation that followed, Pierce, who had become paranoid of law enforcement in the preceding years, supposedly grabbed a knife from the belt of his arresting officer, Frank Wilson, cutting his ear and throat in the scuffle that ensued. Pierce was then shot once by Wilson and would end up passing away while the other officers waited for paramedics to arrive. This was not Pierce's first run-in with police in the years since his release from custody. He had actually been arrested twice in 2008 and had violently resisted authorities on multiple occasions, events that his lawyers and loved ones claimed were onset by his prior incarceration. They stated that Pierce was often talked about being followed by law enforcement, and he believed they were simply biding their time before they arrested him again. The other three suspects have... in all his history with these criminal cops who coerce confessions and lie and hold guns to people's heads who have not been convicted of any crime, I mean, this guy, I mean, how could a special ed ninth grade dropout, like, do they possess the mental tools to kind of handle these run-ins with all these criminal cops? The other suspects have since struggled to readjust to life outside of prison, as their lives were essentially flipped on their heads and permanently altered because of this case. Just a few years ago, in fact, Robert Springsteen asked for Austin police to officially clear his name, as they had continued investigating him as a murder suspect after his release, but have not pressed any charges in the decade since. It's kind of weird. They're admitting they have no evidence against him, but they're also saying they're still investigating him as a suspect. Like... at which point, where you come up with nothing on top of nothing, do you say, okay, well, maybe this guy actually isn't a suspect since there's no actual evidence? It's just so weird. Springsteen took the issue to court, asking for authorities to either finally press charges or declare him innocent, as he was unable to find any legitimate work because of his name being permanently attached to this case. He was also hoping to receive compensation from the state for what he viewed as 10 years of wrongful imprisonment, but because he had never been officially acquitted in a court of law, his petition was overruled by a state judge, who sided with the prosecution, who cited their continued investigation. Man, the corruption runs deep there. That's crazy. So there's no evidence against him. There's criminal cops holding guns to people's heads to get confessions, and yet they're still cited with the corrupt criminal prosecution and cops. Crazy. To this day, none of the four men have been officially exonerated in this case, but after nearly 30 years, no evidence has been presented that links them to this case. After Scott and Springsteen were released from custody in 2009, no charges have been filed against anyone in this case, and there has been no apparent sign of police activity. Even though the release of Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen was a major victory for them and their loved ones, as well as everyone that had contested their guilt for months, if not years, it was a punch to the gut for the victims' loved ones who had trusted investigators to lead the case to resolution. Now the case was right back where it was nearly 20 years prior, unsolved and without any hope on the horizon. There remained a small sliver of optimism that DNA could provide answers, but the DNA testing would ultimately end up creating more questions. In the advanced DNA testing that took place in 2008 and 2009, police found at least 3 genetic profiles. One unknown male who had raped 13-year-old Amy Ayers. His DNA was also found in the body of Jennifer Harbison, indicating that he had raped her as well. A second unknown male whose DNA was found in Sarah Harbison. This was likely another culprit who had acted alongside the first man. A third unknown male whose DNA was found on Eliza Thomas, specifically on the clothing used to bind her wrists. So that's interesting. So let's break this down here. So one suspect attacked Amy Ayers and Jennifer Harbison. A second unknown suspect attacked Sarah Harbison. And a third unknown suspect, his DNA was only found on the clothing to bind her wrists. So he might not have raped or sexually assaulted her. Again, unknown. But there was just simply no DNA recovered other than on the clothing that was used to bind her wrist. Now that's curious. So these apparently are not genius masterminds because they left their DNA. Even though there was the styrofoam used as accelerant possibly and burning all that down and everything, they still left DNA. So there's 3 sets of DNA. There's also a 4th set of DNA here. Additionally, it was found that the DNA of Jennifer Harbison's boyfriend at the time, Sammy Buchanan, was found in her sister Sarah. Wait, what? This indicated to authorities that whoever had raped Jennifer had then raped Sarah, since Jennifer and her boyfriend had had sex hours before she started work. That was the only way investigators believed would explain this transmission of DNA, barring some bizarre happenstance related to the bodies being stacked on top of one another and then set on fire. Okay, so Sammy Buchanan, Jennifer Harbison's boyfriend, Sammy Buchanan, were sexually active. So his DNA was inside Jennifer Harbison. This is kind of weird, though. So there was a mix of... Wait, what? Okay. So the original breakdown here is male 1's DNA is found in Jennifer Harbison and Amy Ayers. Unknown male 2's DNA is found in Sarah Harbison. Now, authorities are speculating that Sammy Buchanan's DNA is found in both Jennifer Harbison and Sarah Harbison. So they're speculating that this DNA was spread by whoever raped her. I mean, that's kind of crazy. Because his DNA is not... because it doesn't state here, unknown male 1's DNA is only found in Amy Ayers and Jennifer Harbison. Unknown male 2 is found only in Sarah Harbison. Unknown male 3 DNA only found on the clothing of Eliza Thomas that is used to bind her wrists. So apparently, just because of the degenerated samples, they did not recover unknown male 2's DNA from both Jennifer and Sarah. Only Sarah, however, Sammy Buchanan's DNA is also found in Sarah as well as Jennifer. So this is kind of crazy. So again, but the other option is if their bodies are stacked and melted into each other, I mean, they could spread that way, I guess. I mean, I don't know. This is obviously very gruesome details here. Yeah, this is kind of weird. A little bit more info here. The DNA recovered from the victims' bodies back in 2008-2009 revealed at least one DNA strand from the body of Amy Ayers. This was a Y STR strand of DNA which is passed through the Y chromosome. This DNA sample could feasibly be used to trace the male lineage of the culprit, but is not specific, meaning that it could be shared among dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of men, making it incredibly hard to track down, especially with privacy laws as they currently stand. This is one of the DNA samples that was compared against the 4 named suspects and ultimately led to the release of Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen from police custody. Because it is a single strand of DNA, this YSTR sample cannot simply be put into a forensics database, despite what TV shows would tell you. Testing for DNA is much more complicated than that. However, in 2017, this sample was submitted into an academic YSTR database operated by the University of Central Florida, where surprisingly it received a match. However, the FBI, who submitted the sample, had been hesitant to release the results, citing federal laws and privacy concerns. They may also be concerned that this strand of DNA is likely shared by thousands of men. This has led to a long and complicated stalemate between the FBI and the family of Amy Ayers, who believe that this match could help investigators narrow in on the culprit, similar to the tactic that was used to catch criminals such as the Golden State Killer and the Daytona Beach Killer. In particular, the testing of YSTR DNA was used in the Boston Strangler case years after the fact, confirming to authorities that the man they had long suspected of involvement, Alberto DeSalvo, was in fact the Strangler. This conflict lingers to this day, with some of the more recent developments happening just recently, February 2020. However, it remains unlikely that this DNA sample will be used to help identify the true culprits of the crime, barring some kind of miraculous development in DNA testing. I mean, technology is moving forward. Investigators and prosecutors continue to stick by the original story, believing that the 4 suspects they named back in 1999 are responsible. See, this is just mind-shocking to me. So these corrupt scum are this stupid They think that there's like 10 people involved in this crime. I mean, they still think these guys are responsible, even though none of the DNA matches and the handlers of the samples were tested and excluded from being the samples. I mean, this is crazy. Maurice Pierce, so they believe, so the investigators and prosecutors continue to stick to their original story. Maurice Pierce, Forrest Wellborn, Robert Springsteen, and Michael Scott, despite one of them now being deceased, Pierce, another never being charged, Wellborn, and the other two being released from prison and unofficially exonerated through DNA testing, Scott and Springsteen. In statements made to the public, officials have hinted that at DNA from the crime scene indicating the involvement of at least 3 individuals who remain unidentified to this day. Investigators once claimed that the DNA might have come from a still unidentified 5th culprit who they claim acted alongside the original 4. No, but do they not know basic math? There's 3 other DNA samples. So there has to be at least a minimum of 7 if they're still going to pretend that these special ed dropouts somehow committed this crime without leaving their DNA, while these other people left their DNA. Oh, this is crazy. Detectives were barely able to simply charge 2 of the 4 original suspects with anything in this case, and in those cases, their sentences were vacated. To me, it seems like the investigators handling the case are too hesitant to admit that they got it wrong back in '99 and spent more than a decade pursuing charges against the wrong guys. Instead of admitting their fault and changing course, their investigation has since come to a complete and total halt and seems to have made no progress in more than a decade. If we go by what the DNA tells us, there was at least one unknown individual that committed this crime who may have been aided by 1 or 2 others that were likely in the yogurt shop just before closing time. This means that they were likely inside the store before 10:50, which was when the female employees typically locked the front door to anyone coming in. If we recall back to the first episode of this series, I described 2 men that were seen in the yogurt shop that night sitting close to the register. They were seen by a couple that night who later reported feeling uncomfortable by the 2 men, who recalled leaving the shop at 10:47 p.m. When they left, the 2 men were still inside. To this day, they remain the only witnesses that police have never been able to track down and interview, and for that reason, they remain potential persons of interest in this case. These 2 men were later described by defense attorney Amber Farrelly on CBS's 48 Hours. Quote, one is described as having lighter hair, maybe like a dirty blonde, about 5'6", late 20s, early 30s. The other is described as a bigger man. Both are described as wearing bigger coats. One is a green coat, army fatigue kind of looking jacket, the other a black jacket. End quote. The DNA at the crime scene may belong to one of these 2, and hopefully in the future more advanced testing can be used to identify them. The victims' loved ones continue to hold out hope that justice can be found, as the 30th anniversary of this tragic crime quickly approaches. Sadly, Maria Thomas, the mother of Eliza, passed away back in 2015, not knowing what happened to her oldest daughter. But the other parents and loved ones of the victims continue to hope that answers can be found for the murdered girls who have been gone for much longer than they were ever alive. The location of the yogurt shop has since become a nail salon, and the women who work there continue to remember the lives lost that cold December night nearly 3 decades ago. Every day, they light a candle for the 4 girls, and regular visitors come to visit the location to pay their respects. A plaque out in the parking lot contains the names of the 4 girls whose tragic legacy continues to live on in this day. As of this episode's recording, the stories of Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, as well as Eliza Thomas and Amy Ayers, remain unsolved. Yeah, I mean, this case is just absolutely crazy. I'm going to have to do a follow-up episode on this because there is further information. I'm just going to go over a couple of comments here posted on Austin Chronicle Online regarding this case. This was posted 11 years ago by Deadeye. I went to high school with the accused as well as with one of the girls. I went to junior high with the elder of the sisters. And the above mention of the boys not being the sort to perpetrate this sort of crime is totally accurate. These guys were Dungeons and Dragons nerds. They were not physically aggressive and were regularly targeted by various cliques of other teens. Their existence was that of prey, not predator. I have never believed for a minute that they had anything to do with these tragic murders. I send my love to all the families involved because they have all suffered unjust tragedy for the past 20 years. Another response here, I know none of the people involved, but have felt Since this happened that the boys were not the perpetrators, it never added up. On top of that, I knew the people who were constantly harassed by the pigs for dressing a certain way. One even moved to another city because of the harassment. I'm assuming this is the persons in black, one of the persons in black. Now it is clear the Austin Police Department has behaved like a bunch of hysterical little expletives for 20 years. That is indeed quite clear. Another comment here by Hawaiian. I had just moved here to Austin in January 1991. I worked across the street at our family balloon shop. I often closed alone. I was 18. I have always felt extremely lucky that this wasn't me. For that reason and an obsession with forensics, I have followed this case closely all of these years. I have to admit the 14 boys as perps always seemed a little random and odd. Why would school friends choose them and why at that time? No one ever had an answer. The confessions made it seem to be an open and shut case. Now for the first time I learned that these two shifty males were actually the last to be with the girls. Two men that seemed nervous and who only ordered a Coke at a yogurt shop is very suspicious. I doubt the security guard is lying. Why would he open such a can of worms? If he were guilty, he could just as easily pin it on the boys already suspected of a crime. That's a good point. No, years of crime file research tells me that the most obvious and easy to follow is the two nervous men. They were nervous at the cash register. They asked to use the employee bathroom. They were nervous about a cop. They were the last known to be there. Their chairs were never turned over. They didn't even order yogurt at a place that offers little else. Why did they come in at all then? They probably came to rob and ravage 4 innocent girls. They have probably done it before. Serious work needs to be done on that DNA. The investigators worked so hard to fit what they wanted into the scenario when the simplest answer is usually the correct one. If anyone knows anything about these men, please come forward, save lives and heartache, and just tell the truth. A response here clarifying the previous comments. There is no connection between the nervous man talking to the security guard and the two men who were seated at the booth near the register. There is an amount of time that passed between those two different sightings. I think much has been made about the no chair placed on the booth table, but there are no loose chairs anywhere. Everything looks uniform. To me, it seems like a real stretch to assume that because there is no chair on the table or maybe the napkin dispenser is empty, that the perps were in that booth. It is possible, though. I mean, witnesses said they were at that booth and there were multiple witnesses, so... I would think, barring any further information, that does seem accurate that these two men were close to the register. And then there was also this third guy who was nervous with the security guard who had to go to the bathroom. So, yeah, I mean, this is episode 1. I do need to do a follow-up. There's actually even more information to go over in this case. And MINDSHOCK is, of course, exhaustive and comprehensive. Hope everybody found another episode of MINDSHOCK True Crime interesting and informative. You can help support the podcast. Donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. You could also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube. Help support the channel. That way, get access to exclusive streams and chats. Like and share Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get a priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcast, or request. You could also be a guest in the podcast depending on your tier. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications so you can get notified when we drop the latest podcasts. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.